Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Solomon McKinney, but everybody calls me Saul. I've been a forest ranger for 21 years now, working the Jefferson National Forest here in Virginia. Before that, I spent 15 years underground in the coal mines until black lung started eating away at what was left of my breath. That's when I figured fresh mountain air might do me some good. People think being a ranger is all about campfires and lost hikers. Truth is, half my job involves old mining sites scattered through these mountains, like scars that won't heal. Most folks don't know there's over 300 abandoned mines in my section alone. Every few months I have to check on them, make sure nobody's fallen down a shaft or gotten themselves lost in the tunnels. I never believed in mine spirits. 21 years underground teaches you that weird noises are just settling rock, and strange air currents are physics, not phantoms. When old-timers talked about mines that breathed or tunnels that whispered, I figured it was just bad air making them hear things. Methane can make a man see all kinds of crazy stuff. But that was before August of 1967, before Devil's Backbone Ridge, before I learned that sometimes the dead don't stay buried. It started with a phone call from the Geological Survey Office in Richmond. They'd been out measuring ground stability for the new highway they wanted to put through Clinch Mountain. Standard work, nothing unusual. But their report mentioned something that made my boss send me out for a look. "Saul," he said, sliding the paper across his desk. "Take a read of this." The report was all technical language, but one line jumped out at me. "Observed regular atmospheric pressure fluctuations at abandoned mine site, consistent with large-scale air displacement occurring approximately every 45 seconds. I looked up at him. Air displacement? That's what they said. Like, if something down there is breathing. The mine they were talking about sat deep in the mountains, about 20 miles from the nearest town. I'd been there twice before over the years, just routine safety checks. Devil's Backbone Ridge, they called it, and for good reason. The terrain was so rough that even the deer trails seemed to go around it instead of through it. This particular mine dated back to the 1890s, when coal companies were pulling black gold out of every mountain in Virginia. The work was dangerous back then, more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. Cave-ins, gas explosions, floods, the mountains claimed their share of miners. I drove out there on a Tuesday morning in August, when the heat was already making the asphalt shimmer like water. My truck climbed the winding mountain road past stands of oak and pine, the air getting cooler as I gained elevation. But when I reached the mine site, something felt wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Just an odd quiet that seemed to press against my ears. Even the wind had stopped. The mine entrance was just like I remembered, a black hole carved into the mountainside, surrounded by rotting timber supports and rusted equipment left behind decades ago. The company had strung chain link across the opening back in the 50s, but time and weather had torn gaps in the fence big enough for a man to walk through. I checked my equipment: gas detector, helmet lamp, rope, first aid kit, everything a ranger needs for underground work. I'd done this inspection dozens of times at other sites. Walk in far enough to make sure the supports were holding, check for any signs of recent activity, fill out the paperwork, and go home. But as I approached the entrance, I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound, like wind moving through a tunnel. Except thus. Here was no wind. The air around me was perfectly still, heavy with August humidity. Yet from somewhere deep in the mine, air was moving in and out, steady as a sleeping person's. Breathing. I stopped at the entrance and listened. The sound came every 45 seconds or so, just like the survey team had reported. A slow inhale, then a pause, then a long exhale that stirred the dead leaves scattered around the mine opening. I'd worked underground long enough to know about air currents, temperature changes, barometric pressure, thermal currents. All of that could move air through a mine. But this was different. This had a rhythm, a pattern that felt almost alive. I clicked on my helmet lamp and stepped through the gap in the chain-link fence. The tunnel sloped downward into the mountains, supported by wooden beams that creaked and groaned with age. My lamp beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls black with coal dust and decades of moisture. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and stale. As I walked deeper, the breathing sound got stronger. I could feel it now, not just hear it. A gentle push of air against my face during the exhale, then a subtle pull during the inhale, like the mountain itself was drawing breath. My gas detector stayed quiet, showing normal readings for oxygen and methane. The supports looked solid enough, no fresh cracks or signs of settling. Everything seemed normal, except for that impossible breathing. About 100 yards in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber where the miners had worked the coal seam. Old rail tracks ran along the floor, and rusted mining carts sat abandoned in the corners. This was as far as I usually went on these inspections, far enough to check structural integrity without taking unnecessary risks. But today, I wasn't alone. "Hello?" a voice called from deeper in the mine. "Is someone there?" I stopped and listened. The voice was female, professional sounding, echoing off the tunnel walls from somewhere ahead. "This is Ranger McKinney," I called back. "What? O's down here?" "Dr. Patricia Stone, Virginia Geological Survey. Thank God someone came. I think I'm lost." I knew Dr. Stone's name from the report. She'd been part of the survey team that first reported the breathing. But what was she doing back here alone? I followed the sound of her voice deeper into the mine, past chambers and side tunnels I'd never explored. The breathing sound was getting stronger, and I noticed something else. The temperature was rising. By the time I found her sitting on a pile of rubble with her flashlight dying, sweat was running down my neck despite being hundreds of feet underground. Dr. Stone was a woman in her 40s, wearing jeans and a Virginia Tech sweatshirt. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her face was pale in the beam of my lamp. "Dr. Stone, what are you doing down here alone?" She looked up at me with eyes that seemed too wide. "I came back to take more readings. The pressure differentials we recorded last week, they don't make sense. There's no natural explanation for what's happening here." I helped her to her feet. "What kind of readings?" "The air movement. It's not random thermal currents or pressure equalization. There's a pattern, a rhythm, like something down here is alive and breathing." As if responding to her words, the mine took another breath. Air flowed past us from the deeper tunnels, warm and humid, carrying a smell that made my stomach turn. Not just the usual odors of a dead mine. This was something organic, like breath from a sick person's lungs. "We need to get out of here," I said. "This isn't safe." But Dr. Stone shook her head. "You don't understand. I've been mapping the airflow patterns. It's not coming from one source, it's the entire mine system. All the tunnels, all the chambers, they're connected. They're working together like lungs." I was about to tell her that was impossible, when my gas detector started beeping. Not the sharp alarm that meant immediate danger, but the steady beep that meant something was changing. The oxygen level was dropping. "Move," I said, grabbing her arm. "Now." We started back toward the entrance, but the tunnel seemed different somehow, longer. The beam of my helmet lamp didn't reach as far, and the walls seemed to press closer. Behind us, the breathing sound was getting faster, more urgent, like something waking up. "Wait," Dr. Stone said, stopping suddenly. "Listen." I listened. Over the sound of our footsteps and the rhythmic breathing, I heard something else. Voices, faint and distant, echoing through the tunnels from somewhere deep in the mine. Men's voices, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. "That's not possible," I whispered. "There's nobody else down here." Dr. Stone's face went white. "Those are the voices I heard before. That's why I came back. They're calling names, Saul. They're calling the names of the miners who died here." The voices grew clearer as we listened. Old-fashioned names, spoken in accents from another time. Thomas McGee, Patrick O'Brien, James Sullivan. My blood went cold. I'd read the historical records for this mine during my ranger training. On November 15th, 1896, a methane explosion had collapsed the main tunnel, trapping over 200 men deep underground. The company had tried for 3 days to dig them out, then sealed the mine and declared them all dead. 200 men, buried alive in the darkness. The voices kept calling names, and I realized they were reading from the same list I'd memorized from the accident report, the list of the dead. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now." But when we reached what should have been the main chamber, we found ourselves in a tunnel I'd never seen before. The walls were different, carved rougher, like they'd been dug in a hurry. And they were warm to the touch. Warm and slightly damp, like skin. The breathing sound was all around us now, coming from every direction. The tunnel walls actually seemed to move, slightly with each breath, flexing in and out like the inside of a chest. Dr. Stone stopped walking and pressed her hand against the wall. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's not just air movement. The rock itself is breathing. The entire mine is alive." That's when my lamp started to flicker, and the voices got louder, calling name after name in an endless roll call of the dead. My helmet lamp died completely, leaving us with just Dr. Stone's dying flashlight. The darkness pressed around us like something solid, and the voices from the deep tunnels grew louder, more insistent. "Thomas McGee, Patrick O'Brien, James Sullivan, Michael Flanagan." They were reading the entire death list from 1896 over and over, in voices that sounded like they were coming from the walls themselves. "This way," I said, trying to remember the path back to the entrance. But every tunnel looked the same in the weak beam of Dr. Stone's light, and I was beginning to suspect we weren't in the same mine I'd entered an hour ago. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. My lungs, already damaged from years of coal dust, were starting to labor. Each breath took more effort, like the mine was slowly stealing the oxygen from the air. "Saul," Dr. Stone whispered. "Look at this." She was shining her light on the tunnel wall where the rock face showed something impossible. Tool marks. Fresh tool marks, as if someone had been digging here recently. But these marks weren't made by modern equipment. They were rough, desperate scratches like someone had been clawing at the rock with their bare hands. "The miners," she said. "They tried to dig their way out." The breathing around us was getting faster, more labored, and I could feel my own heart racing to match the rhythm. It was like being inside something alive, something that was waking up and getting agitated. We kept walking, trying to find our way out, but the tunnels seemed to branch and twist in ways that made no sense. Passages that should have dead-ended kept going. Chambers that should have been small opened into vast spaces our lights couldn't penetrate. And everywhere, carved into the walls, were more scratch marks, desperate gouges in the rock where dying men had tried to claw their way to freedom. "How long were they trapped?" Dr. Stone asked. 3 days, I said. At least that's what the company reported. But looking at these walls, I trailed off, not wanting to voice what I was thinking. The scratch marks went deep, covering entire sections of tunnel wall. This wasn't 3 days of digging. This was weeks. "The company lied," Dr. Stone said, reading my thoughts. "They sealed the mine while the men were still alive. They let them die down here rather than spend the money on a proper rescue." The voices from the darkness seemed to hear her words, because they changed. Instead of just reading names, they started speaking in full sentences, pleading, begging, "Please don't leave us down here. My wife, my children. The air's getting thin. God help us. We can't breathe." The temperature kept rising, and I was sweating heavily now despite being deep underground. The mine was like the inside of a fever dream, hot and humid and alive with the desperate voices of men who'd been dead for 70 years. Then Dr. Stone's flashlight died, and we were plunged into absolute darkness. The voices stopped. The breathing stopped. Everything stopped except the sound of our own panicked gasps in the suffocating air. "Saul?" Dr. Stone's voice was tiny in the darkness. "I'm here," I said, reaching for her hand. "Stay calm. I've got emergency flares in my pack." But before I could get to them, the mine took a breath. The deepest, longest breath I'd heard yet, drawing air from all the tunnels and chambers with a sound like wind through a canyon. And in that rushing air, I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own name. Solomon McKinney, the voices whispered. Come join us, the Solomon. Come breathe with us forever. The mine knew who I was. Somehow, it knew. Light suddenly blazed around us, but not from any flashlight. The tunnel walls were glowing with a sick, phosphorescent glow like the inside of a dying star. And in that strange light, we could see them. The miners. They stood in the tunnels around us, dozens of them, wearing the clothes they'd died in 70 years ago. Their faces were black with coal dust, their eyes hollow and desperate. They reached toward us with hands that passed through the air like smoke. Don't let them seal us in again, one of them pleaded. Don't let them forget us. Dr. Stone screamed, but no sound came out. The mine was stealing the air faster now, pulling it from our lungs with each impossible breath. I could feel my chest burning, my vision starting to go dark around the edges. The dead miners pressed closer, and I understood what they wanted. They didn't want to hurt us. They wanted us to join them, to stay down here forever, to be part of the mine's collective consciousness, to never be alone again in the darkness. No, I gasped, pulling Dr. Stone toward what I hoped was still the way out. We're not staying. But the mine had other ideas. The tunnel ahead of us started to collapse, rocks falling from the ceiling in a deliberate pattern, sealing our escape route just like the company had sealed the mine in 1896. We were trapped with the breathing walls and the desperate dead, and the mine was getting ready to add us to its collection of souls. The tunnel collapse wasn't random. It was controlled, purposeful. Rocks fell in exactly the right places to block our escape without bringing down the entire ceiling. The mine knew what it was doing. It had 70 years of practice. In the phosphorescent glow, I could see Dr. Stone's face turning blue. The mine was pulling oxygen from our lungs faster than we could breathe it in, just like it had done to the trapped miners decades ago. But through my panic, my old mining training kicked in. I knew these mountains, knew how coal seams ran through. The rock. There had to be another way out. Ventilation shafts, emergency exits, something. The disaster site, I gasped to Dr. Stone, where the original explosion happened. There might be a way out through the old workings. She nodded, unable to speak, and we stumbled deeper into the mine, following the glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The dead miners walked with us, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of sight, still wearing the expression of men who knew they were going to die. The breathing around us was frantic now, rapid and shallow, like someone having a panic attack. The mine's collective consciousness was agitated, excited. It could taste our fear, our desperation, our approaching death. Tell them, one of the miners whispered, his voice like coal dust in my ear. Tell them what really happened here. As we walked, the story unfolded around us. Not in words, but in visions. Memories burned into the rock itself. I saw it all. The company supervisors who ignored the gas readings, the mine bosses who forced men to work in dangerous conditions, the executives who chose profit over safety. The explosion hadn't been an accident. They'd known about the methane buildup for weeks. They'd known men would die. But the coal contracts were too valuable to shut down production for safety improvements. 217 men, the voices whispered. Not 200 like they said. 217. They couldn't even count our bodies right. And I saw what had really happened after the explosion. The company hadn't tried to rescue anyone for 3 days and given up. They'd tried for less than 6 hours, then made the decision to seal the mine and write off the losses. It was cheaper to pay death benefits to some of the families than to mount a proper rescue operation. The men hadn't died in the explosion. They'd died slowly over weeks, trapped in the darkness as their air ran out and their food disappeared. Some had gone mad. Others had tried to dig their way out with their bare hands until their fingers were bloody stumps. A few had tried to comfort their friends as the life left their eyes. And when the last miner had drawn his final breath, their collective rage and despair had soaked into the mine itself, turning it into something alive, something that remembered. "We tried to tell people," the voices said. "For 70 years we've tried, but nobody listens. Nobody cares about dead miners." We reached the original disaster site, a vast chamber where the main coal seam had been. The walls here were covered with scratch marks, and in the phosphorescent glow, I could see names carved into the rock. Not just carved, clawed in with dying fingers. Patrick O'Brien, age 34, father of 5. James Sullivan, age 19, to be married in spring. Michael Flanagan, age 42, best damn powder monkey in Virginia. 217 names, each one a life that had been sacrificed for profit. But I also saw something else. A shaft leading upward, blocked with loose rock and debris. An old ventilation shaft that might still connect to the surface. "Dr. Stone," I wheezed, "help me clear this." We started pulling rocks away from the shaft opening, our fingers bleeding, our lungs burning. Behind us, the dead miners watched with eyes full of desperate hope. "Promise us," one of them said. "Promise you'll tell them the truth." "I promise," I gasped. "I'll tell everyone what really happened here." The mine's breathing was getting slower now, deeper, like something settling into sleep. The phosphorescent glow began to fade, and the ghostly miners started to disappear one by one. "Thank you," they whispered. "Thank you for remembering us." Fresh air began to flow down through the shaft we'd cleared. Cold, clean mountain air that tasted like life itself. We climbed through the narrow passage, scraping our knees and elbows on the rough rock, until we finally emerged into blessed daylight and a hillside half a mile from the main mine entrance. I collapsed on the ground, gasping, feeling my damaged lungs work overtime to process clean air. Next to me, Dr. Stone was unconscious but breathing steadily. In my pocket, I found something that hadn't been there before. An old miner's lamp, the kind they used in 1896. It was still warm, and when I turned it over, I saw an inscription. Property of James Sullivan, age 19. The mine had given me proof. Evidence that what we'd experienced was real. Dr. Stone spent 3 days in the hospital, suffering from oxygen deprivation and what the doctors called severe psychological trauma. When she was released, she couldn't remember much about what had happened in the mine. She remembered the breathing, remembered getting lost. But the rest was just fragments. Voices in the darkness, feelings of overwhelming sadness, a sense that something was trying to communicate with her. I never told her about the miners we'd seen, or the true story they'd shared with us. She had enough to deal with just recovering from the physical effects of our underground ordeal. But I kept my promise. I spent the next 6 months researching the 1896 disaster, digging through old newspaper archives and company records. What I found confirmed everything the miners had shown me. The company had known about the gas buildup. They'd ignored safety protocols. And when the explosion happened, they'd written off the trapped men rather than spend money on a proper rescue. The official death toll was indeed wrong. Through census records and family histories, I identified 217 men who'd been working in the mine that day, not the 200 the company had reported. 17 families had never even been notified that their fathers and sons were dead. I wrote a report detailing my findings and sent it to newspapers, historical societies, and government agencies. Most ignored it, but a few picked up the story. Slowly, the truth began to emerge. The State Historical Commission agreed to place a memorial marker at the Devil's Backbone Ridge mine site. All 217 names were engraved on a granite stone, along with the true story of their deaths. The mine entrance was properly sealed with concrete, and the entire area was declared a historical site. For me, the experience changed everything. I couldn't go underground anymore. Even the thought of entering a cave or tunnel sent me into panic attacks. My damaged lungs got worse, as if breathing that supernatural air in the mine had awakened the black lung disease that had been dormant for years. I took early retirement from the Ranger Service and became an advocate for mine safety and workers' rights. I testified before congressional committees about the dangers of abandoned mines and the need for proper safety oversight. I spoke at mining conferences about the human cost of cutting corners on safety. But most importantly, I made sure people remembered the men who died at Devil's Backbone Ridge. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still hear it. The sound of breathing underground, coming from other abandoned mines scattered through these mountains. I've learned that Devil's Backbone Ridge wasn't unique. There are dozens of disaster sites where men died forgotten deaths, where corporate negligence created tragedies that were then covered up or ignored. And I know, deep in my bones, that those places are still alive with the memories of the dead. Dr. Stone went back to her geological work, but she specializes in mine reclamation now. She never mentions what happened to us in the mine, but sometimes I catch her listening to the wind with an expression that tells me she hasn't forgotten everything. She still carries one of her old mining instruments, a beam, aerometric pressure gauge that she checks compulsively whenever she's near an abandoned mine site. She's never told me what she's measuring, but I think I know. She's listening for breathing. Last month, I got a call from a coal mining inspector in West Virginia. He'd heard about my work on the Devil's Backbone Ridge disaster, and he had a problem. An old mine near Beckley was showing signs of unusual air pressure fluctuations. The locals said they could hear voices coming from underground. The company wanted to reopen part of the mine for new coal extraction, but the workers were refusing to go down. "Mr. McKinney," the inspector said, "I know this sounds crazy, but I think this mine might be like yours. Would you be willing to come take a look?" I told him I'd get back to him. But I already know what I'm going to find in that West Virginia mine. Another disaster that was covered up. Another group of dead men who need someone to remember their names. Another corporate crime that needs to be exposed to the light. The thing about forgotten tragedies is that they don't stay buried. They breathe. They wait. And eventually they find someone willing to listen to their story. Some graves are too big to stay closed, especially when they're dug by greed and sealed with lies. And in the mountains of Appalachia, where coal has been king for over a century, there are a lot of graves like that. I can hear them breathing at night, calling for justice, calling for remembrance, calling for someone to finally tell the truth about what happened in the darkness beneath the earth. My name is Solomon McKinney, and I've learned that sometimes the dead don't rest until the living remember their stories. That breathing you hear in abandoned places, that's not just bad air or pressure changes. That's the sound of injustice, waiting for someone brave enough to give it a voice. My name is Elijah Driscoll, but everyone calls me Eli. I've been a park ranger at Wayne National Forest in Ohio for 19 years now. Before that, I taught biology at Ohio University. I thought I'd seen everything the woods had to offer until March of 1986. I'm telling you this story because I need someone to know what really happened up on Devil's Backbone Ridge. The official reports don't tell the whole truth. They can't. Who would believe them? It started with the wildlife cameras. I'd set up 12 of them along the ridge to track deer movement patterns. The pictures they captured made no sense. There were images of a human figure running through the forest at what looked like 40 miles per hour. The timestamps showed the same person covering 5 miles in less than 8 minutes. My graduate student Amy Fletcher thought the cameras were broken. "Dr. Driscoll," she said, pushing her thick glasses up her nose, "these readings have to be wrong. No human can run that fast." I agreed with her. 20 years of studying wildlife, and I'd never seen anything like it. The figure in the photos was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes. But the strangest part was how the animals reacted. In every photo with the running man, the deer were fleeing in panic. Devil's Backbone Ridge gets its name from the narrow spine of rock that runs for 3 miles through the forest. It's only about 20 feet wide at the top, with steep drops on both sides. The Cherokee used to call it something else, a name that meant the running path of spirits. I should have paid attention to that name. The morning I decided to hike up there myself, the weather was turning nasty. March in Ohio means you never know what you'll get. Snow, rain, or sunshine, sometimes all in the same hour. I packed extra gear and told Amy I'd radio in every 2 hours. The trail up to the ridge was muddy from melting snow. Normal deer tracks crossed the path, but every so often, I'd see something else. Human footprints, but spaced about 12 feet apart. No person could take steps that long unless they were jumping. My GPS started acting weird as I climbed higher. The readings jumped around like I was moving at light speed, then stopped completely. My radio crackled with static. The altimeter spun wildly, showing I was at sea level one moment and 3,000 feet the next. When I reached the top of Devil's Backbone, the forest went dead quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you expect in nature, but the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no wind in the trees. Even my own breathing sounded too loud. That's when I saw the footprints on the cliff face. They were pressed into the rock about 50 feet down the north side of the ridge. Human prints, clear as day, running straight down the vertical stone wall. The stride was at least 10 feet between each print. I'm a scientist. I believe in facts and evidence. But standing there, looking at those impossible tracks, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a kid, afraid of the dark. The hair on my neck stood up and my hands started shaking. I radioed Amy, trying to keep my voice steady. "Base camp, this is Eli. I'm seeing some unusual track formations up here." Static. Then her voice came through, faint and distorted. "Dr. Driscoll, you're breaking up. Did you say tracks?" "Human tracks, but they're..." The radio went dead. I tried again, but got nothing but silence. The trees around me seemed to press closer. Somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the sound of bare feet slapping against rock, getting closer. I spent the next hour trying to get my radio working and documenting the strange tracks with my camera. The 35mm film wouldn't lie, even if the equipment was going haywire. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The sound of running feet kept echoing off the ridge walls. Sometimes it seemed far away, sometimes close enough that I'd spin around expecting to see someone. But the ridge was empty, except for me. That's when I found the first piece of real evidence. Hidden under a pile of leaves near the edge of the cliff was an old leather journal wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. The pages were yellow and brittle, but the writing was still clear. It was dated 1794, written by a French fur trader named Jean-Baptiste Moreau. The entries started normal enough. Weather reports, animal sightings, plans for trap lines. But as I read deeper, the tone changed. November 15th. The Shawnee say I should not run the ridge paths. They speak of spirits who guard the ancient ways. I told them I fear no ghosts, only the coming winter. November 20th. Found myself lost in a storm. Followed an old Indian trail along the ridge spine. Kept hearing footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I stopped, they stopped. When I ran, they ran faster. November 25th. It spoke to me. The thing that runs the ridge offered me a bargain. Speed and endurance to survive the winter, to outrun any danger. In exchange for what? I asked. It smiled and said I would understand when the spring came. My hands were trembling as I read. This had to be some kind of joke, or maybe a historical recreation that someone had planted. But the journal felt real, smelled real. The ink had faded the way old ink does. The last entry was different. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. I cannot stop running. It has been 3 days. My feet bleed, but still I run. The paths call to me. The spirit keeps its bargain. I am faster than any man, stronger than any beast. But I understand now. The price was everything else. I will run these paths forever. I was so focused on reading that I almost missed the sound of someone climbing up the trail below me. Heavy breathing, branches snapping, boots on stone. Finally, I thought, someone normal. "Hello?" I called down. You okay down there? The climbing sound stopped. Then clear as day I heard Amy's voice. Dr. Driscoll? Is that you? But something was wrong. Amy was back at base camp, 12 miles away, and her voice sounded strange, like she was out of breath but trying to hide it. Amy, what are you doing here? She appeared at the top of the trail, and I barely recognized her. She'd always been thin, but now she looked like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, and her eyes had a wild, hungry look. I had to come, she said, breathing hard. After you left, I kept looking at those photos. I started seeing patterns in the tracks, like they were calling to me, so I followed them. Amy, you look sick. How did you get here so fast? She laughed, but it didn't sound right. Fast? Dr. Driscoll, I've never felt anything like it. I ran the whole way here. 12 miles in 40 minutes. I know that's impossible, but I did it, and it felt amazing. I stared at her. Amy was not a runner. She got winded climbing 2 flights of stairs. There was no way she could have covered that distance in less than an hour, especially not through rough forest terrain. Show me, I said, not believing what I was hearing. She grinned, and for a second her face looked almost skeletal. Watch this. Amy took off running along the ridge spine. Not jogging, not even fast running, but something that shouldn't be humanly possible. She covered the 20-foot width of the ridge in 2 steps, then leaped across a gap in the rocks that had to be at least 15 feet wide. She landed on the other side and kept running, disappearing around a bend in the ridge. I ran after her, shouting her name. When I rounded the bend, she was standing there waiting for me, not even breathing hard. How? Was all I could manage. I met him, she whispered. The runner. He's been waiting for so long, Dr. Driscoll. He's been alone up here for almost 200 years. He just wants someone to share the paths with. Amy, you're scaring me. We need to get you to a doctor. But she was already moving again, running ahead of me with that impossible, inhuman speed. Every few seconds, she'd stop and look back, like a dog wanting me to follow. I tried to keep up, but normal human legs weren't built for this kind of terrain at this pace. The ridge was getting narrower, more dangerous. One wrong step and I'd fall 200 feet onto the rocks below. That's when I saw him. The figure from the photos was running alongside Amy, matching her pace perfectly. He was tall and gaunt, wearing the rotted remains of what looked like colonial-era clothes. His feet were bare, and I could see that they were worn down almost to the bone. But he never slowed down, never showed any sign of pain. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were wild and desperate, like a trapped animal that had been suffering for years. Please, he called out in a voice that sounded like wind through dead trees. She understands. She knows the joy of the endless run. You can know it too. Amy stopped and turned back to me. He's right, Dr. Driscoll. This feeling, this power, it's incredible. You could have it too. We could all run together. I backed away from both of them. Everything in my scientific training told me this was impossible, but I was seeing it with my own eyes. Amy had somehow gained supernatural speed and endurance, and she was losing herself to it. Amy, this isn't you. We need to get off this ridge. No, she said, and her voice had gotten harder, more desperate. I'm never leaving. The paths are calling me. Don't you hear them? She took off running again, following the gaunt figure deeper along the ridge. I tried to follow, but they were moving too fast. Within seconds, they vanished into the growing dusk. I was alone on Devil's Backbone Ridge, 12 miles from base camp, with no working radio, and the sun going down fast, and I could hear them running in the darkness, calling my name. I made it through the night by building a small fire and staying awake. Every time I started to doze off, I'd hear the sound of running feet and Amy calling for me to join them. The voices seemed to come from all directions, sometimes above me, sometimes below, sometimes right next to my ear. When dawn came, I found more tracks. Amy's boot prints mixed with the bare footprints of the ridge runner, crisscrossing the stone in patterns that hurt to look at. They ran along the cliff edges, up vertical rock faces, and across gaps that no human should be able to jump. I followed the trail as best I could, marking my path with pieces of torn cloth. The ridge was like a maze up there, with side paths branching off in all directions. Some led to dead ends at sheer drops. Others seemed to circle back on themselves. That's when I started to understand. These weren't random trails. They were the old Cherokee running paths that the journal had mentioned. Ancient routes used by Native American messengers to carry news across the mountains. The Ridge Runner was trapped, forced to follow the same spiritual highways that had been sacred for thousands of years. Around midday, I found Amy. She was sitting on a narrow ledge about 30 feet below the main ridge, her legs dangling over a 200-foot drop. Even from a distance, I could see that she'd lost more weight. Her face was gaunt, her clothes even looser than before. "Amy," I called down. "Thank God I've been looking for you all night." She looked up at me with those wild, hungry eyes. "Dr. Driscoll, you have to try it, just once. The running. It's like flying. It's like being alive for the first time." "Amy, you need food and water. You're dehydrating." She laughed. "I don't need food anymore. The running feeds me. The speed gives me everything I need." I could see she was lying. Her lips were cracked, her hands shaking. Whatever supernatural energy was keeping her moving, it was burning up her body from the inside. "How did you get down there?" I asked. "I jumped. Watch." Before I could stop her, Amy stood up on the narrow ledge and leaped straight up, not climbing, not grabbing for handholds. She jumped 20 feet straight up and landed next to me on the ridge. It should have been impossible, but there she was, not even breathing hard. "He taught me," she whispered. "Jean-Baptiste. He's been teaching me all the old paths, all the secret ways through the mountains. Did you know you can run straight down a cliff face if you move fast enough? Did you know you can jump across valleys if you believe you can fly?" I grabbed her shoulders. She felt like she was made of wire and bone, no flesh left on her at all. "Amy, listen to me. This thing, whatever it is, it's killing you. We need to get you to a hospital." She pulled away from me with strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone her size. "You don't understand. I'm not dying. I'm becoming something better, something faster, something free." That's when he appeared again. Jean-Baptiste Moreau materialized at the far end of the ridge, running toward us at that impossible speed. As he got closer, I could see the true horror of what he'd become. His feet were worn down to raw stumps. His clothes were the rotted remains of what he'd been wearing for 2 centuries, and his face was stretched into a permanent expression of desperate hunger. But his legs never stopped moving. Even when he came to a halt in front of us, his feet continued to tap against the stone in a restless, endless rhythm. "She learns quickly," he said in that wind voice. "Better than most. The last one lasted only 3 days before her heart gave out." "The last one?" I asked. But I was afraid I already knew the answer. Hunters, hikers, the occasional researcher like yourself, they find the ridge, they hear the call of the paths. Some resist, some embra. See it. All of them run eventually. Amy was nodding along like this made perfect sense. "He's been alone for so long, Dr. Driscoll. Imagine running the same paths for 200 years with no one to talk to, no one to share the joy of speed with." "This isn't joy," I said, looking at Jean-Baptiste's tortured face. "This is a curse." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. "The forest spirit made a bargain," he said. "I needed speed to survive the winter, to outrun the wolves in the cold. It gave me what I asked for, but it didn't tell me I would never be able to stop. And now you're trying to trap others." "Not trap," Amy interrupted. "Share. He's sharing the gift. And it's wonderful, Dr. Driscoll. You could feel it too. Just for a little while. Just to understand." Jean-Baptiste nodded. "One run with us. Experience the freedom of the endless path. Then you can choose to stay or go." I looked at Amy, at what she was becoming. The supernatural speed was eating her alive, but she couldn't see it. The addiction was too strong. "What if I say no?" Jean-Baptiste's feet tapped faster against the stone. "Then you leave the ridge, and you never come back. The paths are sacred. They must be protected." "And if I say yes?" Amy grinned. showing teeth that looked too sharp. "Then you understand why I can never leave." I thought about the journal entries, about the desperation in Jean-Baptiste's voice when he wrote about not being able to stop. This wasn't a gift, it was a punishment. But Amy was too far gone to see it. "Show me," I said finally. "One run, then I decide." Amy clapped her hands together like a child. Jean-Baptiste nodded solemnly. "Take my hand," he said, "and whatever you do, don't let go." The moment his fingers touched mine, I felt it. Power flowed up my arm like electricity, but warm and inviting instead of painful. My legs felt stronger, my lungs deeper. The world around me seemed to slow down, like I was seeing everything in high definition for the first time. "Now run," Jean-Baptiste whispered. I took a step, then another. Each step covered more ground than should have been possible. The stone ridge flew by beneath my feet. I leaped across a gap that would have terrified me minutes before, landing easy as stepping off a curb. It was incredible. I felt like I could run forever, jump over mountains, race the wind itself. Amy was right. This was like being truly alive for the first time. But as we ran, I started to notice things. The hunger in Jean-Baptiste's eyes never went away. Amy's breathing was getting more desperate even as she ran faster, and I could feel something else in the power flowing through me. A hook, sharp and cruel, sinking deeper into my mind with every step. I understood then why Jean-Baptiste couldn't stop. The supernatural speed came with a supernatural addiction. The more you used it, the more you needed it. And eventually, it was all you could think about. I tried to let go of Jean-Baptiste's hand, but my fingers wouldn't respond. We were running along a section of ridge barely 10 feet wide, with deadly drops on both sides. Behind us, Amy was laughing like a madwoman. "You feel it now," Jean-Baptiste said. "The call of the ancient paths, the joy of endless motion. You understand why I can never rest." I did understand, and it terrified me. The run ended at a grove of ancient oak trees growing in a natural depression along the ridge. As soon as we stopped, the supernatural energy left my body like water draining from a bathtub. My legs turned to jelly and I collapsed, gasping for air. Amy and Jean-Baptiste stood over me, both of them twitching with the need to keep moving. "It gets easier," Amy said, but her voice was getting weaker. "The first few times are rough, but then you don't need to rest anymore. You don't need anything but the running." I looked around the grove and realized where we were. The trees were arranged. In a perfect circle, their roots twisted together like they'd been growing this way for thousands of years. In the center was a flat stone that looked like it had been worn smooth by countless feet. This was a sacred site, a place where the Cherokee had come to commune with forest spirits. "This is where it happened," I said, "where you made your bargain." Jean-Baptiste nodded. "November 25th, 1794. I was lost in a blizzard, half frozen, certain I would die on these mountains. That's when it appeared." The air in the grove began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was March, and it was barely 40 degrees. "You called it back," I whispered. "By bringing people here, by sharing the curse, you're keeping it connected to this place." "I didn't mean to," Jean-Baptiste said, but his voice was uncertain. I was so alone. 200 years of running the same paths with no one to talk to, no one who understood." The shimmer in the air was getting stronger, taking on a vaguely human shape. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from the trees themselves. "The bargain was made freely," it said. "Speed and endurance in exchange for eternal service. The ancient paths must be run. The sacred ways must be kept open." Amy stepped closer to the forming spirit. "You can give me more, can't you? Make me faster, stronger. I'll run your paths forever." "Amy, no." I struggled to my feet. "Look at yourself. It's killing you." But she was already reaching out to touch the spirit form. The moment her fingers made contact, she screamed. Light poured into her from the spirit, but it was cold light, hungry light. She began to convulse, her body stretching and changing. Her legs grew longer, her feet hardened like hooves. her face elongated, becoming more animal than human. "The girl understands," the spirit said. "She embraces the eternal run. She will serve the paths as the Frenchman serves them." Jean-Baptiste was backing away, horror on his face. "You said I was alone. You said that's why I needed companions." "You are not alone," the spirit replied. "There are dozens like you, running the sacred ways across the mountains, each one bound to their paths, each one serving the ancient covenant." I thought of all the missing hikers over the years, all the unexplained disappearances in the Appalachian mountains. How many of them had found their way to places like this? How many had accepted the bargain, thinking they were gaining something wonderful? Amy's transformation was nearly complete. She looked like a nightmarish cross between human and deer, built for nothing but speed and endurance. But her eyes were still human enough to show the terror of what was happening to her. "Please," she whispered, reaching toward me. "Help me." The spirit turned its attention to me. "You have run the paths. You have felt the power. Choose now. Join them willingly, or be bound against your will." I looked at Amy, at Jean-Baptiste, at the ancient stone worn smooth by centuries of sacred rituals. The Cherokee had known about this spirit, had respected it, and feared it in equal measure. They'd called this ridge the running path of spirits for a reason, but they'd also known how to deal with it. I pulled out the Cherokee phrase I'd learned years ago when studying local folklore. It was a prayer of respect, an acknowledgement of territorial rights and spiritual authority. "Wadu, spirit of the ancient ways," I said in Cherokee. "I recognize your claim to these sacred paths. I ask permission to leave your territory in peace." The spirit form wavered, surprised. "You speak the old tongue." "I speak with respect for the original keepers of this land. These paths belong to the Cherokee long before French trappers came looking for easy wealth." Jean-Baptiste's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "I never asked permission. I just took what I wanted from the forest." "As do all your kind," the spirit said, but its voice had lost some of its menace. "You come to the sacred places seeking power, taking what is not offered." "Then let me offer something different," I said. "Recognition, respect, a promise that these paths will be protected from those who would exploit them." Amy collapsed, her transformation reversing as the spirit's attention turned to me. She was still horribly thin, still addicted to the supernatural speed, but she was human again. "What do you offer?" the spirit asked. "My word as a keeper of the forest. This ridge will be declared off-limits to casual hikers. The sacred paths will be protected, and the Cherokee elders will be told of this place, so they can perform the proper rituals." The spirit was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And in exchange?" "Free the Frenchman from his bargain. He's served his time. 200 years is enough." Jean-Baptiste made a sound like a sob. "You would do that? For me?" "For all of us," I said. "This cycle has to end somewhere." The spirit flowed toward Jean-Baptiste, surrounding him with that cold, hungry light. But instead of changing him, it seemed to be pulling something out of him, the supernatural energy that had kept him running for 2 centuries. Jean-Baptiste aged rapidly, his face wrinkling, his hair turning white. But for the first time since I'd seen him, his feet stopped moving. He stood perfectly still, tears streaming down his ancient face. "I can rest," he whispered. "After so long, I can finally rest." He crumbled to dust, but he was smiling as he fell apart. The spirit turned back to me. "The bargain is changed. The paths will be protected through respect rather than fear. But the girl..." Amy was trying to stand, but her body was still fighting the addiction to supernatural speed. She kept twitching, kept looking toward the trail like she was hearing a call I couldn't hear. "She chose the running freely," the spies, Rit said. "The hunger in her will never fully fade. But she can fight it? If she chooses to. If she has reason to." I helped Amy to her feet. She was barely conscious, mumbling about needing to run, needing to feel that speed again. But she was alive, and she was human. "Come on," I said. "Let's go home." As we left the grove, I could feel the spirit watching us. It had accepted my bargain, but I knew it would be testing my word for years to come. The ridge had to be protected, and I would make sure it was. Getting Amy down from Devil's Backbone Ridge took 6 hours. She was too weak to walk properly, and she kept trying to break away from me to run back to the sacred grove. By the time we reached base camp, she'd collapsed completely. The hospital in Athens kept her for 2 weeks. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and what the doctors called exercise addiction psychosis. The official report said she'd gotten lost on the ridge and survived by eating berries and drinking rainwater while obsessively hiking to keep warm. None of them could explain how she'd lost 30 pounds in less than 48 hours. Amy recovered physically, but she was never quite the same. She changed her major from wildlife biology to Native American studies. She learned Cherokee from an elder named Robert Bushyhead and started advocating for the protection of sacred sites throughout Appalachian forests. She never talked about what really happened on the ridge, but sometimes, when we were discussing conservation strategies, I'd catch her looking toward the mountains with a hungry expression. The ridge was closed to public access within a month. I filed reports claiming dangerous geological instability and potential rock slides. The Forest Service bought it without question. Devil's Backbone had always been a liability anyway, too dangerous for casual hikers. But I kept my real promise to the spirit. Robert Bushyhead and 2 other Cherokee elders performed a purification ceremony on the ridge that summer. They said the spirits there had been angry for a long time, feeling forgotten and disrespected by the modern world. The recognition of their territorial rights went a long way toward healing old wounds. I still patrol the ridge regularly, making sure no unauthorized hikers try to access the closed trails. The wildlife cameras I left up there occasionally catch images of something moving too fast to identify clearly. But whatever it is, it stays on the ancient paths and doesn't bother anyone. Amy graduated and went on to work for the Cherokee Nation's Cultural Preservation Department. She never married, never settled down anywhere for long. I think part of her is still up there on the ridge, still running those ancient paths in her dreams. Last month, she sent me an article about unexplained missing persons cases in the Great Smoky Mountains. 7 hikers over the past year, all experienced runners, all disappeared near areas that the Cherokee consider sacred. "We need to talk," she wrote at the bottom of the article. "I think it's happening again." I know she's right. The spirit on Devil's Backbone was just one guardian of one sacred site. There are hundreds of others scattered across the Appalachian Mountains, all of them protecting ancient paths that modern people have forgotten or ignored. Most of the time, they're content to remain hidden. But when someone comes looking for power, looking to take what doesn't belong to them, the old bargains get offered again. Speed and endurance in exchange for eternal service. The freedom of the endless run in return for never being able to stop. Some people think it sounds like a good deal. They're wrong. If you're ever hiking in the mountains and you find yourself on a trail that doesn't appear on any map, if you see footprints spaced impossibly far apart, if you hear the sound of bare feet running on stone when there's no one else around, turn back. Turn back before you meet something that has been running the same paths for longer than you can imagine. Turn back before you hear the offer that sounds too good to refuse. Because once you start running those ancient paths, once you feel that supernatural speed flowing through your legs, you'll understand why Jean-Baptiste Moreau couldn't stop for 200 years. And you'll understand why Amy Fletcher still dreams of running. The paths are always calling, and eventually, everyone runs. My name is Jeremiah Whitfield, but everyone calls me Jerry. I've been a park ranger for 14 years now, working in the George Washington National Forest here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. My specialty is cultural resources. Basically, I take care of old historical sites and make sure they're preserved right. I always thought family curses were just stories old folks told around campfires. Superstition, you know? Something to scare kids with. But after what happened in November of 1979, I know better. Some things are real, whether we want to believe them or not. It started with a call from Dr. Helen Morse, an archaeologist from the university. She'd been working with a small team at an old settlement site deep in Totenfels Hollow. That's German for death rocks, though I didn't think much about that name back then. The site was special because it dated back to the 1740s, when German settlers first came down the Great Wagon Road into Cherokee territory. "Jerry, you need to see this," Helen said over the radio that foggy November morning. Her voice sounded strange, excited but also worried. "We're finding artifacts that shouldn't exist, things that are impossible." I grabbed my field gear and hiked the 3 miles into the hollow. The trail was steep and narrow, cutting through thick woods that seemed darker than they should be, even with the fall leaves gone. As I got deeper, the fog got thicker. It moved in ways that didn't feel natural, swirling around my boots like it was alive. The settlement ruins sat in a small clearing, hidden from the world for over 200 years. Stone foundations poked up through the dirt like broken teeth. A few chimneys still stood, black against the gray sky. There was a small cemetery at the edge of the clearing, with old German headstones that were cracked and covered in moss. Helen met me by what used to be the main house. She was holding something wrapped in cloth, and her hands were shaking. "Look at this," she said, unwrapping a wooden bowl. The wood looked fresh, like it had been carved yesterday. It even smelled like fresh pine sap. "We carbon dated a piece. It's from 1741. Jerry, this bowl is almost 240 years old, but look at it." I touched the bowl. It was warm. Not just room temperature warm, actually warm, like someone had been holding it. In November, with frost on the ground. "There's more," Helen said. She led me to a pile of other artifacts they'd found. A child's wooden doll, still painted bright colors. A leather boot that looked like you could wear it today. A metal cooking pot that shined like new. "This isn't normal preservation," I said, turning the boot over in my hands. "Wood doesn't stay fresh like this, not for centuries." That's what I thought. But Jerry, there's something else. She pointed to a metal detector lying in the grass. "That thing keeps going crazy. It finds metal objects, but when we dig where it says to dig, there's nothing there, just dirt." I picked up the detector and turned it on. Immediately it started beeping. Strong signal, right at my feet. I looked down at the ground, just dead grass and leaves. I moved the detector around. The beeping followed it, like there was metal everywhere, but metal we couldn't see. "It's been doing that all week," Helen said, "and the temperature readings are weird too. The settlement area is running about 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding forest." I took out my own thermometer. She was right. It was 35 degrees in the woods, but 55 degrees standing among the ruins. No reason for it. No underground springs, no protected hollow effect. Just warm ground in a cold forest. That's when I first heard it, a sound like someone chopping wood, echoing from the empty clearing. I looked around, but there was nobody there. Just Helen and me in the silent ruins. "You heard that too?" Helen asked. I nodded. The chopping sound came again, followed by what might have been a woman's voice calling in a language I didn't recognize. Then silence. The fog was getting thicker. It moved between the stone foundations like it was looking for something. And I swear, just for a second, I saw smoke rising from one of the old chimneys. Gray smoke against the gray sky. But when I looked directly at the chimney, there was nothing there. I should have left right then. Should have packed up Helen's team and marked the site as unstable or dangerous or something. But I'm a historian, and this was the kind of discovery you only see once in a lifetime. So I stayed. That first night, I camped at the edge of the clearing with Helen and her graduate student Mark. We set up our tents in a triangle around a small fire. The woods around us were completely quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, no wind. Just silence, so thick it felt like being inside a tomb. Around midnight, Helen woke me up. She was sitting outside her tent, staring at the ruins. "Jerry," she whispered, "look at the settlement." I looked. Every stone foundation was glowing with a soft, warm light. Not electric light, more like firelight, but without any actual fire. The light moved and flickered like flames were burning inside houses that hadn't existed for 2 centuries. "How long has it been like this?" I asked. "About an hour. And listen." I listened. From the ruins came the sounds of daily life, voices speaking in what sounded like German. The creak of a spinning wheel, someone hammering metal, children laughing, a dog barking. All the sounds of a busy settlement coming from empty foundations. Mark was still asleep in his tent, snoring softly. The sounds didn't wake him up. It was like Helen and I were the only ones who could hear them. "We should record this," Helen said, reaching for her tape recorder. But when she turned it on, the sounds stopped. The light faded. Everything went back to normal silence and darkness. The next morning, Mark said he'd slept great, best night of sleep he'd had in weeks. He hadn't heard anything unusual at all. Helen and I didn't talk much about what we'd seen. What do you say? That we saw ghost lights and heard ghost voices? We were scientists. We needed evidence, not stories. But the evidence was everywhere, if you knew how to look for it. The metal detector kept finding things that weren't there. The temperature stayed warm around the ruins. And twice that day I saw smoke from chimneys that were just piles of stone. Helen found something else. She was excavating near the main house foundation when she called me over. She'd uncovered part of a hearth, and inside the old fireplace were bones. Human bones. "This doesn't make sense," she said, carefully brushing dirt off a skull. "This fireplace was for cooking, not burial. Why would human remains be in here?" The bones were old, but not as old as they should be. They looked Native American. The skull shape was wrong for European settlers. And there were marks on them. Cut marks, like someone had used a knife or hatchet. "Jerry," Helen said quietly, "I think these people were murdered, and I think they were burned in this fireplace." That afternoon, while Helen and Mark worked on cataloging the bone fragments, I hiked back to the ranger station to do some research. I pulled out every book and file we had about the early settlement period in this part of Virginia. What I found made my blood run cold. The settlement at Totenfels Hollow had been built by a group of German families in 1740. They'd come down from Pennsylvania looking for cheap land. The Cherokee had warned them that the hollow was sacred ground, a burial place for Cherokee families going back generations. The Germans didn't listen. According to Cherokee oral history, the settlers had killed a Cherokee family that tried to stop them from building on the burial ground. 5 people, a man, woman, and 3 children. The Cherokee said the family had been protecting their ancestors' graves. After the murders, a Cherokee shaman had cursed the land. The curse was supposed to bind the killers' souls to the place where they'd spilled innocent blood. They would be trapped there forever, reliving their crime over and over until they understood the pain they'd caused. 6 months later, the entire German settlement had vanished. When traders came through in 1741, they found empty houses and cold fireplaces. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no explanation. The settlers had just disappeared. But according to Cherokee stories, they hadn't really left. They were still there, trapped by the shaman's curse, doomed to repeat the same day forever, the day they committed murder on sacred ground. I was reading this when my radio crackled to life. "Jerry, you need to get back here now." It was Helen's voice, but she sounded different. Scared. "What's wrong?" "Just get back here. Something's happening to Mark." I ran the 3 miles back to the hollow. The fog was thick again, thicker than it had been all day. By the time I reached the clearing, I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I found Helen kneeling beside Mark's tent. He was inside, unconscious, speaking in fluent German. Helen had her tape recorder running. "He doesn't speak German," she said. "He barely speaks English properly, but listen to him." Mark's voice was different, older, rougher. He was talking about Cherokee devils and protecting the family. He kept saying something about the sacred ground must be ours and God wills it. Then he opened his eyes and looked right at me. But they weren't Mark's eyes. They were older, harder, filled with a hate that went back centuries. "Sie werden alle sterben," he said in a voice that wasn't his. "You will all die." That's when the temperature around us dropped 30 degrees in 10 seconds and the settlement ruins began to glow again. But this time, we could see more than just light. We could see the houses. Complete houses, made of logs and stone, with smoke pouring from their chimneys. We could see people moving around inside them, shadows cast on walls that shouldn't exist. And we could see them looking back at us. Mark stayed unconscious for 3 hours. When he finally woke up, he couldn't remember speaking German. He couldn't remember anything after falling asleep in his tent. But something about him had changed. His eyes kept darting around the clearing like he was seeing things that weren't there. And twice I caught him muttering in German under his breath. "We need to leave," I told Helen. "Pack up the site. We'll come back with a bigger team, maybe some experts in paranormal research." But Helen shook her head. "Look at what we're finding here, Jerry. This is the archaeological discovery of a lifetime. We can't just walk away." She was right, but she was also wrong. Some discoveries aren't worth making. That night, I stayed awake while Helen and Mark slept. I sat by the fire, watching the ruins, waiting for the lights to start again. Around 2 a.m., they did, but this time was different. This time, the ghostly settlement didn't just glow. It became solid. I watched stone foundations grow into complete walls. I saw log houses rise from empty ground, smoke poured from chimneys, and warm yellow light glowed in windows. The empty clearing became a busy settlement, exactly as it would have looked in 1740. And I could see the people. German settlers moved between the houses, doing the work of daily life. A woman hung laundry on a line that stretched between two buildings. Men chopped firewood and tended animals. Children played in the dirt between the houses. They looked real, solid, alive, but there was something wrong with them. They moved too slowly, like they were walking underwater, and they kept repeating the same actions over and over. The woman would hang the same shirt on the line 5 times. The men would chop the same piece of wood again and again. The children played the same game with the same exact movements. They were stuck, in a loop, doing the same things endlessly. Then one of the men looked up and saw me. His face went white with terror. He pointed at me and started shouting in German. The other settlers stopped what they were doing and turned to stare. Their expressions were identical. Pure, unreasoning fear. "Cherokee!" the man screamed. "Cherokee devils!" That's when I understood. The curse didn't just trap them in time. It trapped them in their guilt. To their eyes, anyone who threatened them looked like the Cherokee family they'd murdered, and their response to Cherokee people was always the same: violence. The ghostly settlers grabbed axes and knives and started running toward me. I jumped up and ran into the woods, crashing through underbrush in the dark. Behind me, I could hear them shouting, but their voices were fading. When I looked back, the settlement was dark again, just empty foundations and cold chimneys. I found Helen and Mark's tents torn to pieces. Helen was gone. Mark was lying unconscious in the ruins of his tent, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. I shook him awake. "Where's Helen?" "She went into the settlement," he said in that strange, older voice. "She went to join her people." "What people? What are you talking about?" But Mark just smiled and closed his eyes. I searched the ruins with my flashlight. No sign of Helen anywhere. But near the main house foundation, I found her notebook. The last entry was written in German, in handwriting that wasn't hers. I couldn't read German, but I recognized one word that appeared over and over: Cherokee. Dawn was breaking when I heard Helen's voice calling my name. I followed the sound to the old cemetery at the edge of the clearing. She was standing among the German headstones, but she looked wrong. Her clothes were different, older, like something from the 1700s. Her hair was pulled back in a style that belonged to another century. "Jerry," she said, but her voice had a German accent. "Mein lieber Jerry, you must help us." "Helen, what happened to you?" "The Cherokee devils. They come in the night. They want to kill our children. We must protect the settlement." She wasn't Helen anymore. She was someone else, Someone from 1740 speaking through Helen's body. The curse had claimed her, made her part of its endless loop. Helen, you need to fight this. Remember who you are. You're Dr. Helen Morse, an archaeologist. This isn't real. But the woman wearing Helen's face just smiled. The Cherokee must die. It is God's will. She pulled a knife from her dress, an old German hunting knife that shouldn't exist. The blade gleamed in the morning light as she stepped toward me. You look like them, she said. You have their eyes. Cherokee devil eyes. I ran again. This time I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. But I couldn't leave Helen there. Whatever was happening to her, she was still my friend, still my responsibility. I drove to the nearest phone and called the Cherokee Nation headquarters in Oklahoma. I needed to understand what we were dealing with. An elderly Cherokee man named Joseph Ridge took my call. When I described what was happening at Totenfels Hollow, he was quiet for a long time. That place has been cursed for many generations, he finally said. My great-great-grandfather was the shaman who bound those murderers to the land. The curse was meant to teach them justice, but sometimes justice and revenge become the same thing. How do I stop it? You cannot stop it, but you might be able to end it. The curse will only be broken when both sides forgive, when the Cherokee spirits forgive their killers, and when the German spirits acknowledge their crime and ask for forgiveness. But how do I make that happen? You must speak for the Cherokee family that do, Dandi. You must make the settlers see the truth of what they did, and you must be willing to die for that truth because they will try to kill you when you speak it. That evening I went back to Totenfels Hollow. I carried with me a Cherokee prayer that Joseph Ridge had taught me over the phone, and a bag of sacred tobacco he'd told me to scatter on the graves. The settlement was fully manifested again, glowing with that strange inner light. Helen stood in the center of the clearing, but she was surrounded by the ghostly German settlers now. They all turned to look at me as I approached. Cherokee devil, one of them hissed. You come for our children. No, I said. I come for your souls. The German settlers formed a circle around me, their ghostly weapons raised. In the flickering light, they looked solid, real, dangerous. Helen stood among them, her eyes blank and staring, the knife still in her hand. I know what you did here, I said, speaking to all of them. November 15th, 1740. A Cherokee family came to this hollow to protect their ancestors' burial ground. You killed them, a man, a woman, and 3 children. You murdered them and burned their bodies in your fireplace. The settlers' faces twisted with anger and fear. Lies, one of them shouted. Cherokee lies. You built your houses on top of Cherokee graves, I continued. You knew this was sacred ground. They warned you, but you didn't listen. And when they tried to stop you, you killed them. They were heathens, Helen said in that strange, accented voice. This was our land. God gave it to us. God didn't give you anything, I said. You took it, and you paid the price. That's when the Cherokee spirits appeared. They rose from the ground like smoke, 5 figures in traditional dress. The man was tall and proud, even in death. The woman carried a baby who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. 2 older children, maybe 7 and 9, stood close to their parents. All of them had the wounds that killed them, cut marks on their throats, burn marks on their skin. They looked at the man settlers with eyes full of pain and anger that had lasted for centuries. You see them now, I said to the settlers. You see the family you murdered. The German settlers backed away, their weapons shaking in their hands. For the first time in 240 years, they were seeing their victims clearly, not as Cherokee devils or threats to be eliminated, but as people, as a family. We were protecting our children, one of the German men said, but his voice was uncertain now. They were protecting their children too, I said, their ancestors' graves, their sacred places. They came here in peace, and you answered with violence. The Cherokee father stepped forward and spoke in his native language. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning: pain, grief, a father's rage at watching his family die. "He says you stole their souls along with their land," I translated, though I didn't know how I understood. "He says you turned sacred ground into cursed ground." One of the German women began to cry. "We didn't know," she said. "We were afraid. The wilderness, the strange people, the unknown. We just wanted to be safe." "Fear doesn't justify murder," I said. "And it doesn't justify building a settlement on someone else's graves." The Cherokee mother spoke next, her voice like wind through leaves. This time I understood her words perfectly, even though she spoke Cherokee. "She forgives you," I said, amazed. "After all this time, after all this pain, she forgives you. But she needs you to acknowledge what you did. She needs you to ask forgiveness for yourselves." The German settlers looked at each other, then at the Cherokee family they'd killed. Slowly, one by one, they began to lower their weapons. "Forgive us," the German man who'd first spotted me whispered. "We were wrong. We were so wrong." Helen suddenly gasped and staggered. The strange light went out of her eyes, and she looked around in confusion. "Jerry? What? Where am I?" The curse was breaking. The settlers were seeing the truth, and the Cherokee family was choosing forgiveness over revenge. The supernatural loop that had trapped them all was finally ending. But it wasn't over yet. One of the German settlers, a younger man with rage still burning in his eyes, raised his axe. "No," he shouted. "I will not beg forgiveness from heathens. This land is ours." He swung the axe at the Cherokee father. The ghostly weapon passed through the spirit, but the attack renewed the curse. The settlement blazed with angry red light, and the other German settlers' eyes went blank again. "Cherokee devil!" Helen screamed, raising her knife. "You made us weak!" They all rushed at me at once. I threw myself backward, rolling across the ground as ghostly blades cut the air where I'd been standing. The Cherokee spirits flickered and faded. The moment of forgiveness was lost. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the old cemetery. If I could find the actual Cherokee burial ground, maybe I could break the curse from there. But the German settlers followed me, their weapons whistling through the air. A ghostly axe caught me across the shoulder. I felt real pain, saw real blood. Whatever they were, they could still hurt me. I reached the cemetery and began pulling up stones, looking for the hidden Cherokee graves I knew had to be there. Behind me, Helen and the other settlers were getting closer. "Cherokee must die," Helen chanted. "Cherokee must die." My hands found carved stone beneath the German headstones. Cherokee symbols, older than the settlement. I'd found the original burial ground. I pulled out the sacred tobacco Joseph Ridge had given me and scattered it on the Cherokee graves. Then I spoke the Cherokee prayer he'd taught me, words that felt strange in my mouth but right in my heart. The effect was immediate. The Cherokee spirits returned, stronger than before, but this time they weren't alone. More Cherokee spirits rose from their desecrated graves, ends of them, generations of Cherokee families who'd been buried in this holy place. They surrounded the German settlers, and for the first time in centuries, the murderers were outnumbered by their victims. The German settlers dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. "Forgive us," they pleaded. "Please forgive us." The Cherokee spirits spoke as one, their voices like thunder and wind and flowing water. And somehow, impossibly, I understood them all. They forgave. The light faded slowly, like the sun setting after the longest day in history. The ghostly German settlement dissolved back into empty foundations and cold chimneys. The Cherokee spirits smiled at me once, then faded like morning mist. Helen collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. When she woke up an hour later, she spoke fluent Cherokee for about 5 minutes before switching back to English. She didn't remember anything after the first night at the site. "What happened to us, Jerry?" she asked. I helped her to her feet and looked around the clearing. It looked normal now, just old ruins and overgrown ground, but I could feel the difference. The anger was gone. The curse was broken. For the first time in 240 years, Totenfels Hollow was at peace. "We learned something about justice," I told her. and forgiveness. Mark recovered too, though he had nightmares in German for months afterward. We never told anyone the full story of what happened at the settlement. Who would believe it? Instead, I wrote a report recommending that the site be designated as a sacred Cherokee burial ground and closed to public access. The recommendation was approved. I started working with the Cherokee Nation after that, helping them identify and protect other sacred sites. Joseph Ridge became a good friend, and he taught me more Cherokee prayers and traditions. He said the spirits had marked me as an ally, someone who would speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Helen went back to teaching, but she kept the Cherokee language she'd somehow learned during her possession. She uses it now to help with Cherokee cultural preservation projects. Sometimes she says things in Cherokee that she doesn't remember learning, but they're always kind things. Blessings, mostly. We go back to Totenfels Hollow every November 15th, the anniversary of the original murders, not to study it, but to remember. We bring tobacco and sage, and we say prayers for both the Cherokee family and the German settlers. All of them were victims in the end, trapped by violence and fear. The Cherokee burial ground has proper markers now, placed there by tribal elders. The German cemetery is maintained too, but with a plaque explaining the full history of what happened there. Both peoples are remembered, but the truth is remembered most of all. Sometimes on quiet November evenings, I think I can still hear voices in the hollow. But they're not angry voices anymore. They're peaceful voices, Cherokee and German words mixing together in the wind. The sound of people who finally learned to share the same ground. I still work as a park ranger, but I specialize in cultural consultation now, making sure that Cherokee voices are heard when decisions are made about historical sites. It's important work because the past doesn't stay buried as easily as people think. And I know now that some land remembers every drop of blood spilled on it. Some places hold on to pain and anger for centuries, waiting for someone brave enough to speak the truth and make things right. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's the only thing that can set anyone free, the living and the dead. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, where the temperature doesn't make sense and the silence is too complete, listen carefully. The land might be trying to tell you something. And if you're smart, you'll listen with respect, not fear, because sometimes the dead are just waiting for someone to hear their story, all of their story, the parts that make heroes and the parts that make monsters, and the thin line between them that we all walk every day. That's what I learned at Totenfels Hollow. That's what the Cherokee spirits and the German ghosts taught me when they finally found peace. Some stories are too important to let die, even when they scare us. Especially when they scare us. Because the truth, no matter how frightening, is always better than the lie. Jerry Whitfield retired from the National Park Service in 1995 and now works as a cultural consultant for Cherokee Nation historical preservation projects. Totenfels Hollow remains closed to the public, but Cherokee elders conduct an annual remembrance ceremony there every November. The site is considered one of the most significant Cherokee sacred places in Virginia, and the story of what happened there in 1740 is now taught in Cherokee schools as an example of both historical tragedy and spiritual healing. My name is Isaac Whitmore, and I've been a forest ranger for 13 years. I've seen plenty of things that would make most folks uncomfortable. Bear attacks, lost hikers, accidents that happen when people don't respect the wilderness. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in Pine Ridge Hollow back in October of 1974. I grew up in coal country, right here in Kentucky. My daddy worked the mines, and so did my brother Tommy until a cave-in took him when I was 23. After that, I swore I'd never go underground again. The Forest Service seemed like a good way to stay above ground and still make a living helping people. I specialized in youth programs, teaching kids about nature, showing them there was more to life than coal dust and company stores. That October morning started like any other. The leaves were turning and there was frost on my truck windshield when I drove into the Daniel Boone National Forest headquarters. My supervisor, Jim Patterson, was waiting with a cup of coffee and a worried look. "Isaac, we got a problem," he said, sliding a report across his desk. "Scout troop leader called in yesterday. Says his boys saw some kids playing around Pine Ridge Hollow. You know that area? I knew it. Pine Ridge was 12 miles down a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance since Eisenhower was president. The whole hollow had been evacuated back in 1943 when Blue Diamond Coal Company pulled out. Nothing there but rusted equipment and rotting buildings. Kids shouldn't be out there, I said, reading the report. Place is dangerous, got mine shafts everywhere. That's what I figured. Need you to go check it out before this scout troop does their camping trip next weekend. Make sure it's safe or post some warning signs. I nodded and finished my coffee, standard procedure. I'd done dozens of site inspections over the years. Pack my gear, drive out, take some notes, write a report. Easy day. The drive to Pine Ridge took an hour on roads that got worse with every mile. By the time I reached the hollow, my truck was covered in dust and my back was sore from all the bouncing. I parked at the old company gate, just 2 rusted posts and a chain that had long since broken. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through the trees. Just nothing. I grabbed my pack and started walking down what used to be the main road. The settlement spread out below me like a ghost town from an old Western movie. Company houses lined both sides of the road, their windows dark and empty. At the far end sat the old school building, and behind that, the mine entrance, a black mouth in the hillside that seemed to swallow the morning light. As I walked, I noticed something odd in the dust. Footprints. Small ones. Child-sized. Fresh. I knelt down and studied them. Bare feet, maybe size 3 or 4. A kid, probably 8 or 9 years old. But that didn't make sense. The nearest road was 12 miles away, and these prints were clear as day in coal dust that hadn't been disturbed in 30 years. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed off the empty buildings and died. "Anyone out here?" Nothing. I followed the prints toward the school building. They led right up to the front steps, then seemed to disappear. I climbed the steps and peered through the broken door. Inside, old desks sat in neat rows, covered in dust and bird droppings. A chalkboard still hung on the far wall, and I could just make out some letters written in faded white chalk. October 15th, 1943. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. That was the day the mine closed. The day everyone left Pine Ridge Hollow, now for good. I backed away from the school and checked my watch. Only noon, but something felt wrong about this place. The shadows were too deep, the silence too complete. Even my radio was acting up, crackling with static every time I tried to call into dispatch. That's when I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. Children laughing. The laughter came from somewhere deeper in the hollow, near the old mine entrance. It sounded like kids playing tag or hide and seek. Pure joy. The kind you only hear when children think no adults are watching. I followed the sound, my boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The air got colder as I walked, and my breath started showing in little puffs. Strange, since it had been a warm morning. "Kids, you need to come out," I called. "This place isn't safe. There are old mine shafts everywhere." The laughter stopped. I waited, listening. Then I heard footsteps running, like children scattering to hide. The sound echoed off the hollow walls, making it impossible to tell which direction they'd gone. I reached the mine entrance and stopped. A heavy wooden barrier had been built across the opening decades ago, with big red signs that read, "Danger, no entry." But there was a gap at the bottom, just big enough for a child to crawl through. My flashlight flickered when I pointed it at the gap. I smacked it with my palm, and it steadied. The beam showed more footprints in the coal dust, lots of them, all child-sized, all heading into the mine. "Damn it," I muttered. Those kids could be hurt or lost in there. I had to go in. I squeezed through the gap, grateful for all those years of staying in shape. The mine tunnel was about 6 feet high and supported by rotting timber beams. My flashlight beam showed the tracks continuing into the darkness. "Hello?" I called. "Kids, if you're in here, you need to come toward my voice. This place could collapse at any time." Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a child giggled. I followed the sound deeper into the mine. The air grew colder with each step, and that strange, sweet smell got stronger. Key peppermint candy. The walls closed in, and I had to duck to avoid the low ceiling beams. That's when my flashlight died. Complete darkness. The kind of black you only find deep underground, where no light has ever been. I fumbled for my spare batteries, trying not to panic. The darkness pressed against me like something alive. A child whispered, "Mister, do you want to play with us?" The voice came from right beside me. So close, I should have been able to reach out and touch whoever spoke. But when I swept my arm through the air, I felt nothing. "Where are you?" I whispered back. "We're here," said another voice. This one came from behind me. "We've been waiting so long for someone to play with." My hands shook as I tried to get the flashlight working again. Finally, the beam flickered on. The tunnel was empty. But there, in the coal dust at my feet, were fresh handprints. Small ones. A dozen or more, pressed into the dust like children had been crawling on their hands and knees all around me. I ran. I don't remember much about getting out of that mine, just stumbling through the darkness, banging my head on low beams until I saw daylight ahead. I squeezed through the gap and fell to my knees outside, gasping for air. My hands were shaking as I reached for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Whitmore." Static answered me. "Dispatch, do you copy?" More static, then a faint voice. "Isaac, you're breaking up. Say again?" "I'm at Pine Ridge Hollow. We've got children down in the old mine. Possible search and rescue situation." "Did you say mine?" "Isaac, you're ing up. Can't clearly." The radio died completely. I looked back at the mine entrance. In broad daylight, it looked ordinary. Just an old hole in the ground with some rotting boards across it. But I could still smell that sweet peppermint scent drifting out. I decided to head back to my truck and drive you until I could get clear radio contact. Let someone else figure out how to get those kids out safely. I was paid to inspect sites and write reports, not play hero in dangerous mines. But as I walked back through the settlement, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Roy Hendrick's maintenance truck was parked behind the old company store. Roy was the Forest Service mechanic, a good man in his 50s with 3 kids of his own. He must have driven up while I was in the mine. But why wasn't he answering when I called his name? I found him lying on the ground behind his truck, unconscious. At first I thought he'd had a heart attack or heat stroke. But when I knelt beside him, I saw something that didn't make sense. Roy's hair had gone completely white. Not gray. Pure white, like fresh snow. And his face, God help me, his face looked like he'd aged 20 years since I'd seen him last week. His eyes fluttered open. "Isaac?" His voice sounded weak, older. "What happened? I came up here to check the road conditions, and there were children playing. They wanted me to join their game." "What game, Roy?" "Ring Around the Rosie." He struggled to sit up. "Sweetest little kids you ever saw. But their hands were so cold." I helped him to his feet, but he could barely stand. Whatever had happened to him, he needed a doctor. Fast. "We're getting out of here," I said. "Right now." But as we walked toward the trucks, I heard it again. Children laughing, coming from the mine entrance. And this time, I could swear I heard them singing, "Ring around the Rosie, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down." Getting Roy down the mountain took 2 hours. He kept falling asleep, and twice I had to stop and check if he was still breathing. By the time I got him to the hospital in town, his pulse was barely there. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened to him. All his tests came back like he was 75 years old, not 52. They admitted him for observation and started running more tests. I went home that night, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those children singing. And I kept thinking about the handprints in the mine, pressed into coal dust that should have been undisturbed for 30 years. The next morning, I drove to the local library and asked to see old newspapers from 1943. The librarian, Mrs. Morrison, was happy to help. She remembered when Pine Ridge closed down. "Terrible thing," she said, pulling out a thick folder of yellowed newspapers. "All those families just packed up and left overnight. Blue Diamond Coal said the mine was played out, but folks whispered it was something else." I found the October 16th, 1943 edition of the local paper. The headline read, "Mine Disaster Claims 12 Children." My hands shook as I read the article. 12 children from Pine Ridge had been playing near the mine entrance when a section collapsed, sealing them inside. The rescue effort lasted 3 days before Blue Diamond officials declared it too dangerous to continue. The bodies were never recovered. "We regret this tragic accident," the company spokesman was quoted as saying. "We have provided compensation to the families and will be relocating them to our other properties." But there was something odd about the article. It was buried on page 3 in small print. For a story about 12 dead children, it seemed like the paper was trying to hide it. I kept reading and found a follow-up story from a week later. It was even shorter, just 2 paragraphs about how the families had been relocated to other company towns, and the mine had been permanently sealed for safety reasons. No names, no ages, no details about the children who died. I asked Mrs. Morrison if she had any other records from that time. She disappeared into the back room and returned with a cardboard box full of old school records. "Pine Ridge Elementary," she said. "I saved these when they cleaned. Out the building. Thought someone might want them someday for historical purposes." I opened the box and found a class roster dated October 1943. 12 names with little photos attached. Sarah Beth Combs, age 6. Billy Ray Whitaker, age 7. Jenny Sue Morgan, age 8. Tommy Lee Hayes, age 9. Mary Ellen Price, age 7. Johnny Dale Evans, age 10. Susie Ann Collins, age 6. Bobby Joe Turner, age 8. Laura May Simpson, age 9. Danny Carl Brooks, age 7. Nancy Ruth Parker, age 8. Jimmy Dale Foster, age 11. I stared at their faces, school photos with gap-toothed smiles and carefully combed hair. Just normal kids who should have grown up, gotten married, had children of their own. Instead, they were trapped forever in that mine. That afternoon, I got the call about Roy. He'd died in the hospital. Heart failure, the doctor said, but they couldn't explain why a healthy 52-year-old man's body had just worn out. It was like he'd aged decades in a single day. I knew what had killed Roy Hendricks. Those children in the mine. Somehow, they'd drained the life right out of him. I should have reported the mine to be permanently sealed, should have posted warning signs and filed my report recommending the area be declared off-limits. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 12 kids trapped down there in the dark for 30 years. That evening, I drove back to Pine Ridge Hollow. The sun was setting as I parked at the gate. The shadows were longer now, and that unnatural silence seemed even deeper. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the mine entrance. "Sarah Beth," I called out as I approached. "Billy Ray, Jenny Sue, I know you're down there." The silence stretched on. Then, faintly, I heard a child's voice. "How do you know our names?" "I found your school records," I said, sitting down on a fallen log near the mine entrance. "I know what happened to you. The mine collapsed in 1943. A different voice spoke, this one closer to the entrance. "That was so long ago. We've been waiting for someone to play with us." "Are you going to play?" asked a third voice. "The man yesterday played with us, but then he had to sleep." My throat went dry. They were talking about Roy. "I want to help you," I said, "but I need to understand. Why can't you leave this place?" Silence. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. "We can't find the way out." The shadows were getting deeper. Soon it would be full dark and I'd be alone in this hollow with whatever those children had become. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. "Show yourselves," I said. "Let me see you." The air grew colder. My breath started showing in puffs. And then at the edge of my vision, I saw movement. Children stepped out from behind the old buildings. 12 of them, just like in the school photos. But wrong. All wrong. Their skin was pale as moonlight, and their clothes were the same ones they'd worn to school that October day in 1943, faded and torn now, covered in coal dust. But it was their eyes that made me want to run. Dark, empty holes where eyes should be. They moved toward me, walking hand in hand like they were playing a game, and they were singing in voices sweet as church bells. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. As they sang, they formed a circle around me, still holding hands, still smiling with those terrible empty eyes. "Play with us," said Sarah Beth, the little 6-year-old with pigtails. "We're so lonely." "We've been waiting so long," added Billy Ray. "Please play with us." They started to close the circle, their cold hands reaching out toward me, and I realized with growing horror that they meant to drag me into their game, just like they had Roy Hendricks. I broke and ran for my truck. Behind me, their laughter filled the hollow like breaking glass. I made it maybe 50 yards before I realized running was useless. The children were everywhere, ahead of me, behind me, on both sides. Not chasing exactly, more like herding me back to war. The mine. Every time I tried to go around them, another pale figure would step out from behind a building or tree. They moved without sound, their bare feet making no noise on the gravel. Road. "Please don't run," called little Jenny Sue. "We just want to play." I stopped in the middle of the road, my heart hammering. "What do you want from me?" "The same thing we wanted from the other man," said Tommy Lee, the 9-year-old with the cowlick. "To not be alone anymore." They formed their circle around me again, but this time they kept their distance. About 10 feet away, just at the edge of my flashlight beam. In the growing darkness, their pale faces seemed to glow. "You killed Roy Hendricks," I said. "We didn't mean to hurt him," said Mary Ellen. Her voice sounded sad. "He just got tired from playing. Sometimes the grown-ups get tired." "We don't understand why," added Johnny Dale. "Back when we were alive, grown-ups could play all day." Alive. At least they knew they were dead. "Listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep hurting people." "But we're so lonely," whispered Susie Ann, the littlest one. "It's dark down in the mine and cold, and we can't find our way home." "Your home isn't in that mine," I said. "Your families are gone. They died a long time ago. You need to move on." "Move on to where?" asked Bobby Joe. "We don't know where to go." The circle started to close again. I could feel the cold coming off them now, like standing near an open freezer. My breath came out in thick puffs. "We know you work with children," said Laura May. "We watched you sometimes when you brought school groups to the forest. You understand us." "You're kind," added Danny Carl. "Kinder than the company men who sealed us in the mine. They could hear us calling for help, but they just kept piling rocks in front of the entrance." My blood went cold. "They could hear you?" "For 3 days," said Nancy Ruth. "We called and called, but nobody came. The rocks kept falling and the air got thin, and then we went to sleep," finished Jimmy Dale, the oldest. "When we woke up, everything was different. We could walk through walls and see in the dark, but we couldn't leave the hollow." The truth hit me like a punch to the stomach. The mine collapse hadn't been an accident. Blue Diamond Coal had sealed those children in there deliberately, probably to cover up some safety violation or avoid a lawsuit. They'd listened to 12 kids crying for help and chosen to bury the evidence instead of saving them. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry that happened to you." "Will you play with us now?" asked Sarah Beth. "Will you help us not be lonely?" They stepped closer. Their hands reached out toward me, and I could see that their fingertips were black with coal dust. The same coal dust that had aged Roy Hendricks 20 years in a single day. "If I play with you," I said, backing away, "I'll die, won't I? Just like Roy." "Maybe," said Tommy Lee, "but you won't be lonely anymore. None of us will." I bumped into something hard and cold, the old company store building. I was trapped between the building and the circle of pale children. "There has to be another way," I said. "What do you really want? Not to play games. What do you really need?" The children looked at each other. For a moment, they seemed almost normal, just kids trying to figure out a difficult problem. "We want to go home," said Jenny Sue, "but we don't remember the way." "We want our families," said Billy Ray, "but they're gone." "We want people to remember us," said Mary Ellen, "to know what really happened." That was it. That was the key. "Your names," I said. "Blue Diamond Coal tried to erase you. No names in the newspaper, no proper burial, no memorial. It's like you never existed." "We existed," said Susie Ann fiercely. "We were real." "I know you were real," I said. "I saw your school photos, Sarah Beth Combs, Illy Ray Whitaker, Jenny Sue Morgan, Tommy Lee Hayes, Mary Ellen Price, Johnny Dale Evans, Susie Ann Collins, Bobby Joe Turner, Laura Mae Simpson, Danny Carl Brooks, Nancy Ruth Parker, Jimmy, Dale Foster." As I spoke each name, the child it belonged to seemed to glow brighter. By the time I finished, they were all staring at me with something like hope in those dark eye sockets. "You remember us," whispered Jimmy Dale. "I remember you," I said. "And I'll make sure other people remember too. I'll tell everyone what really happened here. I'll make sure you get a proper memorial." The children looked at each other again. Then, one by one, they started to smile. Real smiles. Not the terrible, empty grins from before. "Would you do that for us?" asked Sarah Beth. "I promise," I said. The cold air began to warm. The oppressive silence lifted, and I could hear normal night sounds returning to the hollow. Crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance. "Thank you," said Jenny Sue. And then, like morning mist touched by sunlight, they began to fade. "Don't forget us," called Mary Ellen as she disappeared. "Never," I promised. Within minutes, I was alone in Pine Ridge Hollow. But it felt different now. Not hostile or wrong, just empty. An empty place where something had finally found peace. I walked back to my truck on shaking legs and drove home through the darkness. The next morning I filed my report. Not the usual site inspection form, but a detailed account of everything that had happened. I included copies of the newspaper articles and school records, along with my recommendation that Pine Ridge Hollow be designated as a memorial site for the 12 children who died there. My supervisor read the report twice, then looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Isaac, you can't be serious about this." "Dead serious," I said. "Those kids deserve recognition. What happened to them was murder, plain and simple. Blue Diamond Coal covered it up and the community let them." Jim Patterson leaned back in his chair. "Even if I believed this ghost story, which I don't, you're talking about accusing a major coal company of deliberately killing children. You got any proof besides some old newspaper clippings and your word?" I didn't. The only proof had been Roy Hendricks, and he was dead. But I kept my promise anyway. I wrote letters to historians, genealogy societies, and local newspapers. I researched the families and found living relatives, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd never known what happened to their lost family members. Slowly, the real story of Pine Ridge Hollow began to spread. It took 3 years, but eventually the State Historical Society agreed to place a memorial marker at the site. Nothing fancy, just a simple granite stone with 12 names and the words, "In memory of the children of Pine Ridge, lost but not forgotten." I was there the day they dedicated it. About 50 people showed up, mostly descendants of the dead children. An old woman named Grace Combs, Sarah Beth's great-niece, brought flowers and laid them at the base of the stone. "Thank you," she said to me afterward. "We always wondered what happened to Aunt Sarah Beth. The family story was that she just disappeared one day." That night, I drove back to Pine Ridge Hollow alone. The memorial stone looked solid and permanent in my headlights, a promise kept to 12 lonely children. I sat there for an hour, waiting, hoping, maybe, to see them one more time, to know for certain they'd found peace. But the hollow remained quiet. just an empty place with old buildings and a granite memorial, like dozens of other forgotten settlements scattered through the Kentucky mountains. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. There, carved into the bark of an old oak tree near the memorial, were fresh initials: SBC plus BRW plus JSM plus TLH plus MEP plus JDE plus SAC plus BJT plus LMS plus DCB plus NRP plus JDF, all 12 children marking their presence. A one last time before moving on to whatever comes next. I stayed with the Forest Service for another 10 years before retiring. During that time, I helped establish safety protocols that probably prevented dozens of accidents. I became something of an expert on abandoned mining sites and their hazards, but I never forgot the hollow children. Sometimes when I'm working with kids at summer camps or school visits, I catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of my vision. A pale figure standing just outside the circle of campfire light, watching with protective eyes. It doesn't frighten me anymore. I think of it as Sarah Beth or Jenny Sue, making sure no other children get forgotten or left behind. People ask me sometimes if I really believe what happened at Pine Ridge Hollow, if I think those children were actually ghosts. I tell them this: there are worse things in this world than ghosts. There's greed that values profit over human life. There's indifference that lets tragedies be covered up and forgotten. There's the kind of loneliness that comes from dying unmourned and unremembered. The children of Pine Ridge Hollow aren't lonely anymore. Their names are carved in stone now, and their story lives on in the people who visit that memorial. They found their way home at last. But there are other hollow places in these mountains, other forgotten tragedies where the dead might still be waiting for someone to remember their names. I just hope that when those stories come to light, someone will have the courage to listen, because the dead have long memories, and they don't like being ignored. My name is Ezekiel Hawkins, but everyone calls me Zeke. I've been a forest ranger for 18 years now, working the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. Most folks think my job is about putting out campfires and helping lost hikers, but the truth is, I spend most of my time hunting moonshiners. I've busted over 200 illegal stills in these mountains. I know every trick in the book: how they hide their smoke, where they dig their pits, how they move their product down the mountain trails at night. My great-grandfather was one of the best shiners in these hills back in his day, so I guess you could say I know the business from both sides. That family history always sat heavy with me, like a shame I couldn't wash off. The old-timers around here love to tell stories about deals with the devil. They say some moonshiners got so desperate for success they'd sell their souls for the perfect recipe or the biggest operation. I always figured those were just mountain tales, the kind of nonsense that comes from too much sampling your own product. That was before July of 1955. Before I met the thing that lives in Copperhead Hollow. It started with Snake Patterson, my best informant. Snake wasn't his real name, of course, just what everyone called him on account of how quiet he could move through the woods. He'd been feeding me information about illegal stills for 3 years, and he'd never steered me wrong. Snake found me at the ranger station on a Tuesday morning, sweating through his shirt despite the early hour. The July heat was already building, and we'd been in a drought for weeks. Everything was brown and dying. "Zeke, you need to stay away from Copperhead Hollow," he said, not even bothering with his usual greeting. His hands were shaking. "What's got you spooked, Snake?" "There's something wrong up there. Real wrong. They got a still running that shouldn't be. Impossible." I poured him some coffee and waited. Snake was tough as nails. Whatever had him rattled was worth hearing about. "I watched them for 3 nights, he said. "They're making 200 gallons a day, Zeke, with equipment that should only make 20, maybe 30 on a good day. And the whiskey." He stopped, stared into his coffee cup like it might have answers. "What about the whiskey?" "It glows. I swear on my mother's grave that stuff glows like it's got fire inside it." I almost laughed. Almost. But Snake's face was dead serious. And in 18 years of law enforcement, I'd learned to trust my instincts about people. Snake was scared, and Snake didn't scare easy. "Who's running the operation?" "Tobias Crow and his boys. But Zeke, there's something else. The plants around that still, they're all dead. Not drought dead, something else. Like the life got sucked right out of them. And the smell, he shuddered. Smells like sulfur mixed with rotting eggs. I made up my mind right there. Whatever was happening in Copperhead Hollow, I was going to put a stop to it. In 18 years, I'd never met a moonshiner I couldn't handle, supernatural or not. I'll head up there tonight, I told Snake. Do some surveillance, see what's what. Snake grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard. Don't go alone, Zeke, please. There's something evil up there. I can feel it in my bones. But I was already planning my route. Copperhead Hollow was deep in the mountains, accessible only by old deer trails and moonshiner paths. No roads, no easy way in or out. Perfect place for an illegal operation, and perfect place for me to do my job. I should have listened to Snake. I should have waited for backup, followed protocol, done things by the book. But I was proud, and I was curious, and I thought 18 years of experience made me ready for anything. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. I hiked into Copperhead Hollow just before sunset, moving quiet through the rhododendron thickets. The heat was still brutal even with the sun going down, and the drought had left the creek bed nothing but cracked mud and scattered stones. Something felt off from the moment I entered the hollow. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. My compass started acting strange about a mile in, the needle spinning lazy circles instead of pointing north. I figured it might be iron deposits in the rock. These mountains were full of minerals that could mess with a compass. I'd seen it before. The still was exactly where Snake said it would be, tucked back in a grove of dead oak trees. But when I got my first good look at it through my binoculars, I had to shake my head and look again. The thing was massive, bigger than any operation I'd ever seen. 3 copper pot stills gleamed in the fading light, connected to an elaborate system of coils and condensers. Steam rose from multiple boiling points, and the whole setup hummed with activity. But there were only 2 men tending it, and they moved with an efficiency that seemed impossible. I settled in behind a fallen log about 50 yards away and watched. The men worked without talking, like they knew exactly what the other was thinking. They moved heavy barrels like they weighed nothing, and they never seemed to tire or need rest. As full dark fell, I got my first glimpse of something that made my skin crawl. The whiskey glowed, not bright, not like electric lights, but with a soft, steady glow that seemed to come from inside the liquid itself. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen, and I'd seen plenty of strange things in 18 years of mountain law enforcement. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were adding some kind of chemical, something that would make the liquor look special to buyers. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. The glow was too steady, too natural, like moonlight trapped in glass. Around midnight, I saw him. A tall figure in a black suit walked out of the darkness and started inspecting the operation. He moved between the stills with authority, checking gauges and nodding approval. The 2 workers treated him with obvious respect, almost fear. But here's what made my blood run cold. The man cast no shadow. The fires under the stills threw shadows from everything else, but where he stood, there was nothing. I tried to get a better look through my binoculars, but every time I focused on him, the image seemed to slip away like smoke. My radio crackled with static, and for just a moment I could have sworn I heard screaming mixed in with the white noise. The man in the suit suddenly stopped and turned toward my hiding spot. Even from 50 yards away, I could see his smile, white teeth gleaming in the darkness. He raised one hand and pointed directly at me. That's when I ran. I stumbled through the woods in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothes, rocks turning under my feet. Behind me I could hear laughter. Not human laughter, but something else. Something that made my bones ache with cold despite the summer heat. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, and I didn't stop driving until I was back home. But even then, safe in my own bed, I could still smell sulfur on my clothes. The next morning, I told myself it was just shadows and imagination. Too much time alone in the woods, too many of Snake's stories getting into my head. I'd go back in daylight with backup and handle this like any other illegal operation. But when I tried to call for backup on my radio, all I got was static and that same distant screaming. Snake Patterson was found dead that afternoon. They found him sitting against a tree about a mile from his cabin, clutching a mason jar of glowing whiskey. The coroner said he looked like he'd aged 50 years over neg. Hair gone white, skin wrinkled and spotted like an old man's. But the strangest part was his face. Snake died smiling, like he'd seen something wonderful right before the end. The jar was still warm when they found it, and the whiskey inside pulsed with that same soft light I'd seen at the still. When the sheriff tried to open it, the smell of sulfur nearly knocked him over. That's when I knew this wasn't just about illegal moonshine anymore. Something was hunting in Copperhead Hollow, something that killed people and left them grinning like fools, and I was the only one who'd seen it and lived to tell about it. I should have called for federal backup, should have contacted the ATF, brought in a whole team of agents to handle whatever was happening in that hollow. Instead, I drove back up there the next day with nothing but my .38 revolver and a head full of questions. The drought had gotten worse overnight. Plants that had been green just yesterday were brown and brittle, like someone had sucked all the life right out of them. The temperature seemed to rise with every step I took deeper into the hollow. I found the still operation shut down, the fires cold, no sign of the workers. But the equipment was still there, and those barrels of glowing whiskey sat lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. I approached one of the barrels carefully, hand on my gun. The whiskey inside swirled without any wind to move it, and when I leaned close I could hear something that sounded like voices whispering from inside the liquid. That's when I found the contract. It was nailed to the biggest oak tree, written on what looked like parchment, but felt warm to the touch. The ink was dark red, too dark for any pen I'd ever seen. At the bottom, in flowing handwriting, was a signature, Tobias Crow, and beneath it, in different handwriting entirely, the gentleman. Most of the words were in some language I didn't recognize, but there were phrases in English that made my stomach turn. Soul in payment for prosperity, eternal service in exchange for earthly success. The family line bound until debt is paid. I was so focused on reading that I almost missed the sound of footsteps behind me. Fascinating reading, isn't it, Mr. Hawkins? I spun around, gun drawn, and found myself face to face with the man in the black suit. Up close, he looked normal enough, well-dressed, handsome in a sharp-featured way, with eyes that seemed almost black in the shadowy hollow. Tobias Crow? I asked, though I knew it wasn't him. This man carried himself with too much authority, too much confidence. He was the boss, not the employee. Oh no, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Crow works for me. Has for almost a year now, ever since he found himself in desperate need of enhancement for his family business. The man's smile was pleasant, but it never reached his eyes. You can call me the gentleman. Everyone does. I kept my gun pointed at his chest, though something told me bullets wouldn't do much good. You're under arrest for operating an illegal distillery on federal land. He laughed, and the sound made the dead leaves on the ground rustle and move. Oh, my dear Ranger, you still think this is about moonshine, don't you? This is about so much more than that. The temperature around us started to rise. I could feel sweat beating on my forehead, and the metal of my gun grew hot in my hand. Your great-grandfather knew what this was about, the gentleman continued, starting to walk in a slow circle around me. Old Jacob Hawkins, finest moonshiner in these mountains until he developed a conscience. I offered him the same deal I offered Mr. Crow, prosperity beyond his wildest dreams, success that would make his family rich for generations. My blood ran cold. You're lying. Am I? He stopped circling and faced me directly. Jacob Hawkins had the finest still operation these mountains had ever seen. Then the government crackdown came, and he was facing Pissamomden, rising, losing everything. I offered him a simple bargain, his soul in exchange for supernatural success, whiskey that would never run dry, customers who would never stop coming. protection from the law that would last forever. I wanted to pull the trigger, but my hand wouldn't move. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the air shimmered around the gentleman like summer asphalt. "But your great-grandfather was a fool," he continued. "He chose poverty and shame over prosperity. He chose to let his family struggle rather than accept my generous offer. Such a waste." "What does that have to do with me?" The gentleman's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. "The contract remains open, Mr. Hawkins. The offer stands for any member of the Hawkins family. Your great-grandfather may have refused, but you're a practical man. You understand the value of success." Behind him, I could see figures emerging from the woods, the two workers from the night before, but changed. Their skin had a grayish pallor, and their eyes glowed with the same light as the whiskey. They moved with that same eerie coordination, like puppets controlled by the same hand. "Think about it," the gentleman said. "You could have everything you've ever wanted. Respect, prosperity, power. No more chasing criminals through the woods. No more living with the shame of your family's past. All I ask in return is your soul. And really, what are you doing with it anyway?" The heat was making it hard to think, hard to breathe. My gun felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the gentleman's words were starting to make a terrible kind of sense. "I could make you the most successful law enforcement officer in the country," he whispered. "You could catch every criminal, solve every case, be the hero you've always wanted to be. All it would cost is your signature on a piece of paper." For just a moment, I almost said yes. The temptation was so strong it made my chest ache. All my life, I'd felt like I was fighting an uphill battle against my family's reputation, trying to prove that not all Hawkinses were criminals. But then I remembered Snake's face, that horrible smile frozen in death. And I knew what that signature would really cost. "Go to hell," I managed to say. The gentleman's pleasant expression never changed, but the temperature around us dropped 20 degrees in an instant. "Oh, Mr. Hawkins, I'm afraid that's where you'll be going if you don't accept my offer. You see, you've seen too much, learned too much. I can't let you leave this hollow alive unless you're working for me." The two gray-skinned workers started moving toward me, and I could see that their fingernails had grown into claws. My gun hand finally responded, and I pulled the trigger. The bullet passed right through the first worker like he was made of smoke. He kept coming, that terrible smile on his face, and I knew I was in more trouble than any law enforcement training had ever prepared me for. I ran again, crashing through the dead underbrush with those things behind me. But this time I wasn't running blind. I had a destination in mind, the old family cemetery where my great-grandfather was buried. If the gentleman was telling the truth about Jacob Hawkins, maybe there were answers waiting there. The cemetery sat on a ridge above the hollow, overgrown with weeds but somehow untouched by the supernatural drought. The moment I crossed onto that ground, I felt different, cooler, calmer, like I'd stepped into the shade after hours in burning sun. My great-grandfather's headstone was weathered but readable. Jacob Hawkins, 1858 to 1943, he chose the harder path. Carved beneath it was a small cross and words I'd never noticed before. "Some prices are too high to pay." Behind me, I could hear the gentleman and his workers approaching, but they seemed to slow as they neared the cemetery. I knelt by the grave and pressed my hand to the earth, and I swear I could feel something there. Warmth, protection, like invisible arms wrapping around me. "Clever boy," the gentleman called from the edge of the cemetery. "But you can't stay there forever. This ground may be blessed, but my reach is long, and your friends are already mine." That's when I saw them. 3 more Forest Service vehicles coming up the mountain trail. My backup had finally arrived, but something was wrong. They moved too fast, took the curves too sharp, like the drivers didn't care about safety anymore. The trucks stopped at the base of the ridge, and 5 Rangers got out. I recognized them all, good men, experienced officers, but their eyes glowed with that same sickly light as the whiskey, and they moved with that same puppet-like coordination. "They were thirsty after their long drive," the gentleman called. "I offered them refreshment. They accepted much more readily than you have. The possessed rangers started up the hill toward me, and I knew my .38 wouldn't stop them any more than it had stopped the others. But as they reached the edge of the cemetery, something remarkable happened. They stopped. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't take another step. Whatever protected this ground was stronger than the gentleman's influence. "Interesting," he said, walking closer himself. "Your great-grandfather was more prepared than I thought. But no blessing lasts forever, Mr. Hawkins. Eventually, you'll have to leave that protection. And when you do..." He didn't finish the threat, but he didn't need to. I looked around the cemetery desperately, searching for anything that might help. That's when I saw it. A small mausoleum I'd never noticed before, built into the hillside like it was trying to hide. The door was slightly open, and something inside caught the moonlight. I made a run for it, and the possessed rangers immediately tried to follow, but they still couldn't cross onto the blessed ground. I reached the mausoleum and pulled the door open. Inside was a small room, and on a stone shelf sat an old leather journal, a silver crowlet, and a mason jar filled with clear liquid that definitely wasn't whiskey. I grabbed all three and started reading by the light of my flashlight. The journal was my great-grandfather's, and the story it told made everything clear. The creature came to me in the winter of 1893, when the government was shutting down stills across the mountains. He offered me wealth and success beyond imagination, whiskey that would never run dry, and customers who would never stop coming. All he wanted was my soul. I was tempted. God forgive me, I was so tempted. But my Hannah was pregnant with our first child, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him a legacy of damnation. I refused. The creature was angry, but the contract was already written. He said it would remain open for any member of my bloodline, waiting for someone desperate enough or greedy enough to sign. I've done what I can to protect my family. This ground is blessed, sanctified with holy water and righteous purpose. The silver cross was blessed by 3 different preachers and will burn any creature of hell. The jar contains water from the baptism spring at Cades Cove. It will break any demonic influence. If you're reading this, it means the creature has returned for another generation. Fight him, child. Don't let him take what God gave you freely. I looked up from the journal to find the gentleman standing just outside the mausoleum. He couldn't enter. The protection extended even here, but his face had changed. The human mask was slipping, and I could see something else underneath. Something with red skin and yellow eyes and teeth like broken glass. "Touching family reunion," he snarled, and his voice no longer sounded human. "But you still can't stay there forever." "Maybe not," I said, grabbing the silver cross and the jar of holy water. "But I don't need forever. I just need long enough." I walked back out to face him, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I had a fighting chance. The cross grew warm in my hand, and the holy water seemed to pulse with its own light. "You made a mistake," I told him. "You assumed I'd be like you, willing to take shortcuts, willing to sacrifice anything for success. But my great-grandfather taught my family something more valuable than that." The gentleman's true form was becoming more visible now, 7 feet tall, with horns curving from his skull and smoke rising from his skin. "What did he teach you, little ranger?" I smiled and pulled the original contract from my pocket, the one I'd taken from the tree. "He taught us that some prices are too high to pay." And with that, I touched the silver cross to the contract and poured the holy water over both. The effect was immediate and devastating. The gentleman screamed, a sound like metal tearing and steam escaping, and the contract burst into flames that burned white-hot and cast no smoke. The possessed rangers collapsed as if their strings had been cut, and all across the hollow, I could hear the sound of glass breaking as the cursed whiskey turned back into ordinary corn mash. The gentleman's form began to waver and fade, but his voice carried clearly across the cemetery. "This isn't over, Hawkins. The bloodline is long, and there are always more desperate souls looking for easy answers. Maybe, I said, but they'll have to get past me first. He vanished with a sound like thunder, and the oppressive heat lifted from the hollow like a weight being taken off my chest. The Rangers recovered within an hour, confused and disoriented, but alive. They had no memory of drinking anything or being controlled. To them, they'd just arrived to provide backup and suddenly felt dizzy. I didn't try to explain what had really happened. Some things are better left as mysteries. The still operation was destroyed, not by explosion, as my official report claimed, but by something more thorough. The copper equipment had melted into unrecognizable shapes, and the barrels had cracked open, spilling ordinary corn mash that soaked harmlessly into the ground. Even the dead trees began showing signs of new growth. I kept my great-grandfather's journal, the Silver Cross, and what remained of the holy water. They felt like inheritance now, tools passed down from one generation to the next for a battle that might not be over. 3 months later, I was promoted to district supervisor. Good cases, successful arrests, commendations from my superiors. Nothing supernatural about it. Just the result of 18 years of experience and dedication finally being recognized. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd gotten the success I'd always wanted, but earned it the hard way instead of the easy one. I still patrol these mountains, still hunt moonshiners, and help lost hikers and put out campfires. But now I'm watching for other things too. Places where the plants die without reason. Stills that produce too much, too fast. Whiskey that glows in the dark. Because the gentleman was right about one thing. There are always desperate people looking for easy answers, and some prices are too high to pay, even if you don't realize it until the bill comes due. Last week I got a call about a still operation over in Blount County. The informant said the whiskey glowed like trapped moonlight, and the men running it worked with supernatural efficiency. I'm heading over there tomorrow with my great-grandfather's Silver Cross in my pocket, and the knowledge that some family legacies are worth fighting for. My name is Ezekiel Hawkins, and I'm a guardian as much as I am a ranger. The mountains hold more secrets than most people know, and some of those secrets are darker than others. But as long as there are people willing to stand between the light and the dark, willing to choose the harder path over the easy one, there's hope. Even in Pool, places where the devil likes to make his deals. My name is Tobias Aldrich, but everyone calls me Toby. I've been a ranger in the Pisgah National Forest for 11 years now, specializing in search and rescue. 47 successful rescues, they tell me. 47 people who went home to their families because I knew how to read tracks, follow clues, and never give up. I used to think that was enough. I used to think the mountains only held natural dangers. Bears, cliffs, sudden storms. Mountain witches? That was just old stories the local folks told around campfires. Superstition from a time when people didn't understand the world. Then came September of 1962, when everything I thought I knew fell apart like wet paper. It started with Billy Morrison, 8 years old, red hair and freckles. His family was camping near the Blue Ridge Parkway when he wandered off during dinner prep. Standard stuff. Kids get curious, see something interesting, forget to stay close. We get these calls maybe once a month. But Billy's tracks told a strange story. I found his sneaker prints clear as day in the soft dirt near their campsite. Size 2 Keds, worn tread on the left heel where he dragged his foot. The trail headed straight up the ridge toward Granny Blackthorn's Cove, a hollow 6 miles from the nearest road that most folks avoided. "You sure you want to go up there?" Helen Carpenter asked me. Helen was a local volunteer, knew these mountains better than anybody. She'd helped on maybe 20 searches over the years. Good woman, tough as nails. But I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "It's just a hollow, Helen. Kid probably got turned around, found some shelter." "Ain't just any hollow." She adjusted her pack, wouldn't look at me directly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about that place. Said a witch lived up there back in the old days. Granny Blackthorn, they called her. Sweet as pie to your fool. Ace, but she had a taste for children." Helen, come on. It's 1962. I know what year it is, Toby, but I also know 3 children have gone missing near that cove in the past 2 months. And I know my compass starts spinning crazy when I get within a mile of that place. I checked my own compass. Needle pointed steady north, like always. Equipment gets funny in the mountains sometimes. Magnetic deposits in the rocks. But as we hiked up the ridge trail, my radio started acting strange. Instead of the clear chatter from base station, I kept hearing something that sounded almost like children laughing. Faint, but there. I adjusted the frequency, checked the battery. The sound stayed. You hear that? I asked Helen. She nodded, face pale. Started about a mile back. The trail to Granny Blackthorn's Cove was overgrown but well-defined, like something used it regular. Billy's tracks showed clear in every patch of soft ground, always heading straight toward the hollow. No wandering, no signs of confusion. That bothered me. Lost kids usually zigzag, backtrack, show panic in their stride. Billy's prints looked purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. The forest felt wrong, too quiet. In 11 years of mountain work, I'd learned to read the woods like a book. Birds should be calling this time of evening. Squirrels should be rustling through leaves. But everything was silent except for our footsteps and that distant laughter from my radio. When we crested the ridge and looked down into the hollow, Helen grabbed my arm. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. Smoke was rising from the chimney of the old cabin ruins. Nobody had lived in Granny Blackthorn's Cove for 75 years. I knew that for a fact. The state had surveyed this area in the 1940s when they were expanding the national forest. Every structure was documented, every old homestead cataloged. The cab, in down there, burned out in 1887, according to the records. Nothing left but foundation stones and a crumbling chimney. But smoke was definitely rising from that chimney. Could be campers, I said, more to convince myself than Helen. Someone set up camp in the ruins. Campers don't usually bring children's toys. Helen pointed back at the trail. I turned and saw what she meant. There, hanging from a low branch about 20 feet behind us, was a small wooden doll. Hand-carved, simple dress painted blue. It looked old, but not weather-worn, like someone had just hung it there. I was sure it hadn't been there when we passed. "Stay close," I told Helen, unclipping my flashlight. The sun was setting fast behind the ridge, and the hollow was already deep in shadow. Billy's tracks continued down the slope, following an old deer path between the rhododendrons. But now, there were other tracks too. Bare footprints, small and child-sized, crisscrossing the trail from different directions. Some looked fresh. Others were older, filled partially with fallen leaves. How many kids had been through here? At the bottom of the hollow, the old cabin materialized out of the twilight like something from a dream. It should have been a ruin. Instead, I saw walls of weathered logs, a porch with carved railings, windows glowing yellow with lamplight. Garden beds full of herbs ran in neat rows beside the house. The air smelled of wood smoke and something sweet, like cookies baking. "This isn't possible," I said. Helen had stopped walking. She stood frozen in the middle of the path, staring at the cabin with wide eyes. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. "Helen, you okay?" She didn't answer, didn't even blink. Just kept staring at the house with that strange expression, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and my radio crackled to life with perfect clarity. "Toby, you out there? This is Base." I grabbed the radio. "Base, this is Toby. I'm in the Blackthorn Hollow with Helen. We found some kind of structure, signs, of recent habitation. The missing Morrison boy may be here." "Say again? You're breaking up pretty bad." I looked at my radio, full signal strength. "Base, do you copy? I said we're in the hollow and—" The radio dissolved into static, then went silent. But just before it cut out completely, I could swear I heard a child's voice saying, "Come play with us, mister. Granny's been waiting." A door creaked open on the cabin porch. She looked exactly like what a grandmother should look like. Gray hair in a neat bun, flower on her apron, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, probably weighed 90 pounds soaking wet. The sort of woman who'd offer you fresh cookies and ask about your family. "Evening, folks," she called, voice warm as honey. "Y'all look lost. Why don't you come on up? Have some supper. I just pulled a batch of gingerbread from the oven." Every instinct I'd developed in 11 years of mountain work screamed danger. But looking at her, I felt my suspicions start to fade. She was just an old woman, living alone in the mountains. Probably didn't even know she was on federal land. Happened more than you'd think in these remote areas. "Ma'am, I'm Ranger Aldrich. We're looking for a missing boy. 8 years old, red hair. His tracks led us here." "Oh my, yes. Little Billy, sweet child. He's inside having some milk and cookies. Been worried sick about his family." Relief flooded through me. "He's safe?" "Safe as houses, dear. Come on in, both of you. It's getting cold out there." I started toward the cabin, but Helen caught my arm. Her grip was iron strong, and when I looked at her face, I saw raw terror. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't go in there." "Helen, it's okay. She's got Billy. We found him." "Look at her eyes," Helen hissed. "Really look." I turned back to the old woman on the porch. She was still smiling. Ealing still looked harmless as could be, but when I focused on her eyes, they were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, black as coal. And in that darkness, tiny lights flickered like stars, or like the reflection of children's faces. "Don't be shy now," the woman said, and her voice had changed slightly. Still sweet, but with an edge underneath, like honey poured over broken glass. "Granny Blackthorn doesn't bite. Much." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost began forming on the herbs in her garden. Somewhere behind the house, wind chimes made of bone started clicking together, playing a tune I almost recognized. A lullaby, the kind mothers sing to help children sleep. I grabbed Helen and pulled her back up the path, away from whatever that thing was pretending to be. Behind us, I heard the old woman's voice change completely, deeper, rougher, filled with ancient anger. "Now that's just rude, dearie, after I've been so hospitable. After I've taken such good care of all the lost children who've found their way to my door." We ran. Helen stumbled over roots and rocks, but I kept her moving. Behind us, that terrible voice followed, no longer even pretending to be human. "You can't take them from me. They're mine now. Their souls keep me young and strong. I've waited so long for fresh ones." The woods around us began to change as we climbed. The autumn leaves turned brown, then fell in great drifts. Snow started to fall, thick and heavy. Within minutes, we were running through a winter landscape, our breath burning cold in our lungs. "What's happening?" Helen gasped. "I don't know." I checked my compass. The needle spun in wild circles, never settling on any direction. "Just keep moving." We made it maybe half a mile before Helen collapsed. She'd been slowing down for the past few minutes, and when I looked back at her, I saw why. Her dark hair had gone completely gray. Lines had appeared around her eyes and mouth. She looked like she'd aged 20 years in the space of our run. "Helen, what?" "She's doing it," Helen whispered, and her voice sounded older too. Weaker. "Granny Blackthorn. She's taking my years, my life, using them to power her magic." I knelt beside her, tried to help her up. "We need to keep moving." "Can't. Too tired." Helen's eyes were closing. As I watched in horror, more gray streaked through her hair. More lines appeared on her face. "She's had me before, Toby. When I was 8, same as Billy. Same as all the others." "What are you talking about?" "I got away, but not all the way. Part of me stayed with her. Part of my soul. That's why I could feel her influence. Why I knew the stories were true. And now she's calling that piece back." Helen's hand was cold in mine, and getting colder. "Helen, stay with me." "Listen," she said urgently. "The children aren't dead. She keeps their souls, feeds on them to stay alive. That's why she looks young in her true form, why she's lived so long. But the souls, they're still aware, still trapped. How do you know this? Because I can hear them. Helen's eyes went wide, staring at something I couldn't see. They're singing, Toby. All the lost children singing together. They want to go home. They want to rest. A child's laughter echoed through the trees, coming from every direction at once. Not the innocent sound of kids playing, but something twisted and wrong, like a music box running down. She knows where you are, Helen whispered. She's been watching you for years, ever since your sister. My sister? The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah? But she disappeared when I was 12. That was 25 years ago, down in Tennessee. Helen gripped my hand tighter. Where in Tennessee? The Smoky Mountains. Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We were camping with our folks. The memory came rushing back, clear as yesterday. She went to pick berries, found a nice old woman who said she knew where the best ones grew. She followed the woman into the woods and she never came back. I stared at Helen's aging face. You're saying she's here? That Sarah's soul is trapped with this creature? Your sister's been protecting you all these years, guiding your career in search and rescue, making sure you became good at finding lost children, because she knew someday you'd come for her. The laughter grew louder, closer, and underneath it, I heard something else. A girl's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. Toby? Toby, help us, please. Sarah. My little sister, Sarah. Helen's hand went slack in mine. When I looked down, she was unconscious, breathing shallow and fast. She looked like she was in her 70s now, hair white as snow, skin paper thin. But she was alive. I heard footsteps on the frozen leaves behind me, slow, deliberate steps coming down the path from the hollow. I turned and saw the old woman walking toward us, but she was changing as she moved, growing taller, more gaunt. Her kind face was melting away like wax, revealing something ancient and terrible underneath. Her true form was a nightmare made flesh. 8 feet tall, thin as a scarecrow, with fingers like tree branches and teeth like broken stones. Her hair was white as bone, hanging in tangled ropes around a face that belonged in a grave. But worst of all were her eyes. Still black, still full of those flickering lights that I now knew were trapped souls. "Hello, Tobias," she said, voice like wind through a cemetery. "I've been waiting for you to visit. Your sisters told me so much about you." Behind her, shapes moved in the darkness. Small figures, child-sized, with empty eyes and mouths that hung open in silent screams. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All the children she'd taken over the years. And at the front of that ghostly crowd, I saw a girl with pigtails and a summer dress. Sarah. You recognize her, don't you? Granny Blackthorn gestured to my sister's ghost. Sweet little Sarah. She's been my special helper all these years. Her soul burns so bright, gives me such strength. Sarah's spirit looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared. 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, grass stains on her dress from playing. But her eyes were hollow, and when she opened her mouth to speak, no sound came out. She was trying to warn me about something. "Let them go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "All of them. Take me instead if you want, but let the children go." The witch laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, you sweet fool. I don't trade souls. I collect them, and yours will make a fine addition to my family." She raised one gnarled hand, and I felt something cold wrap around my chest. Not physically, something deeper than that. She was reaching for my soul, trying to tear it loose from my body. The pain was indescribable, like having your heart ripped out while you were still alive. I fell to my knees, gasping, while she began to pull something essential out of me. "Don't fight it, dearie. It only hurts for a moment. Then you'll be with your sister forever." But Sarah's ghost suddenly stepped forward, placing herself between me and the witch. For just an instant I felt warm instead of cold, protected instead of exposed. "Get back, child," Granny Blackthorn snarled. "You belong to me." Sarah shook her head. She pointed at something on the ground near Helen's unconscious form. My eyes followed her gesture and saw it. A cluster of mountain laurel, the pink flowers bright even in the supernatural winter the witch had created. Mountain laurel. Poisonous to humans in large doses, but I remembered something from my childhood. My grandmother always said it could ward off evil spirits, protect against witches and harmful magic. I crawled toward the plant, fighting against the witch's pull on my soul. She realized what I was doing and shrieked in fury. "No! Those flowers won't save you. Nothing will save you." But as my hand closed around the laurel stems, I felt the witch's grip on me weaken. The ghost children around her began to glow brighter, more solid. Some of them started to speak. "She's weakening," one little boy said. "The flowers hurt her," added a girl with braids. Sarah nodded urgently, then pointed toward the witch. She mouthed a single word. "Now." I stood up, clutching the mountain laurel like a weapon. The witch backed away from me, her black eyes wide with something I'd never expected to see in them. Fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice losing its terrible power. "I need them. Without their souls, I'll die. I'll turn to dust. I've lived for so long, seen so much. You can't just end me." "Watch me," I said, and I meant it. I stepped forward, holding the laurel out like a shield. Where the flowers touched her, the witch's false flesh began to smoke and bubble. She screamed, a sound that shattered ice from the trees and sent birds fleeing from their roosts. "Please," she begged, and for a moment she looked like a frightened old woman again. "I never meant to hurt them. I was just so lonely, so afraid of dying alone." "You made that choice a long time ago," I said. "Now they get to choose too." I pressed the laurel against her chest, right over where a human heart would be. Light exploded from the contact point. Not harsh white light, but warm and golden, like sunlight through stained glass. The witch dissolved, flesh falling away like autumn leaves. But as she died, all the trapped souls she'd collected over the decades came rushing out in streams of light. They swirled around me like fireflies, each one pausing to whisper, "Thank you," before floating up toward the sky. Sarah was the last to go. She stood before me for a long moment, solid and real as she'd ever been. Then she smiled, that gap-toothed grin I'd missed for 25 years, and reached out to touch my face. "I'm proud of you, big brother," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "You saved us all." "I love you, Sarah. I never stopped looking." "I know. That's why I led you here. That's why I made sure you became so good at finding lost children. Because I knew someday you'd find me." She kissed my forehead, and I felt 25 years of guilt and grief lift from my shoulders. "Take care of Billy," she said. "And Helen. They're going to need you." Then she was gone, dissolved into golden light that rose up into the winter sky and disappeared among the stars. I found Billy Morrison inside the cabin, which had become real ruins again the moment the witch died. He was unconscious, but breathing, curled up in a nest of old blankets with no memory of what had happened. Just another lost kid who'd wandered too far from his campsite. Helen aged back to normal within an hour. Though she claimed to remember everything, she never talked about it much after that, but sometimes I caught her staring off into the mountains with a thoughtful expression, like she was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. The official report listed Billy's case as a standard wilderness rescue. Kid got lost, found shelter in old ruins, mild exposure, and dehydration. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make headquarters question my sanity or fitness for duty. But I kept the mountain laurel I'd used to destroy the witch, pressed between the pages of my incident log. And I started paying closer attention to the missing children cases that came across my desk. Turned out there were patterns, if you knew how to look. Kids disappearing near certain hollows, certain old homesteads. Reports of helpful strangers who offered to show the way. Families who'd been affected by similar disappearances generations back. I became something of a specialist in those kinds of cases, the kind where the official explanation never quite fit, the kind where you needed more than tracking skills and wilderness medicine to bring. The children home. Word gets around in the search and rescue community. Rangers started calling me when they had cases that felt wrong, that seemed to follow supernatural rules instead of natural ones. I always went. I always brought mountain laurel, and I always listened for the voices of trapped children calling for help. Some people say I'm crazy. They point out that I've never found evidence of anything truly supernatural since that night in Granny Blackthorn's Cove. They say it was just stress, isolation, a guilty conscience about my sister creating elaborate hallucinations. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head. But I've brought home 43 more children in the 20 years since that September night. 43 kids who might have stayed lost if someone hadn't been willing to look in the dark places. The places where rational people don't go. And sometimes, when I'm working a case in the deep woods, I hear my sister's voice on the wind. Just a whisper, just a hint, guiding me toward another trapped child who needs to come home. I've learned to trust that voice, because whether it's real or just my imagination, it's never steered me wrong. The mountains are full of old stories, old dangers. Most of them are just folklore, the kind of tales people tell to explain things they don't understand. But some of them are true. Some of them are warnings, and some grandmothers aren't what they seem. If you're ever hiking in the deep woods and you meet a kindly old woman who offers to show you the way home, remember what happened to Billy Morrison. Remember what happened to my sister Sarah. Remember all the children who followed sweet voices into dark places and never came back. Trust your instincts. Carry mountain laurel. And never, ever follow strangers into the hollow places where the old magic still lives. Because out there in the mountains, some things are older and hungrier than you can imagine. And they're always looking for new children to add to their collection. My name is Ezra Buchanan, and I've been a forest ranger for 17 years. My grandfather cut timber in these West Virginia mountains. My father did too, until an accident with a falling oak left him using a cane. I thought I'd be different. I thought managing forests and protecting them was better than cutting them down. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, especially about what lives in the woods. December 1981 was the coldest winter I'd ever seen on Shavers Mountain. Snow piled 3 feet deep, and the temperature hadn't climbed above 0 in 2 weeks. I should have been home with my wife, drinking coffee by the fire. Instead, I was hiking 8 miles through wilderness to check on an old clear-cut area that was supposed to be growing back. The helicopter pilot, Buck Hayes, had called it in that morning. "Ezra, you need to see this," he'd said over the radio, his voice shaky. "That section you've been replanting near the old logging camp, something's not right up there." "What do you mean, not right?" "I mean there's trees where there shouldn't be trees. Big ones. Old ones." I figured Buck had made a mistake. Pilots see a lot from up there, and snow can play tricks on your eyes. But I had to check. It was my job to know every acre of the Monongahela National Forest, especially the sections that were coming back from the logging companies. The hike to Spruce Knob took me through some of the prettiest country in West Virginia, even in winter. The snow muffled every sound except the crunch of my boots and the whistle of wind through pine branches. I carried my usual gear: radio, first aid kit, measuring tools, and my grandfather's old Pulaski axe. He'd used it to cut timber. I used it to mark trees for protection. By noon, I'd reached the edge of what used to be the Consolidated Timber Company's biggest clear cut. They'd taken every tree off 100 acres. Back in the 1920s, then left when an avalanche killed 47 of their workers. The company never even came back for the bodies. That's when I saw what Buck meant. Where there should have been young pine trees, maybe 15 feet tall after 60 years of growth, stood massive oaks and maples. Trees that looked 200 years old. Trees with trunks so wide I couldn't wrap my arms around them. Trees that shouldn't exist. I checked my map twice. This was definitely the clear-cut area. But these trees were older than the logging company. Older than my grandfather. They should have been cut down 60 years ago, but somehow they were still here. The forest was too quiet. No bird sounds. No squirrel chatter. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The snow didn't stick to some of the tree trunks, just slid right off like they were warm. When I touched one of the big oaks, the bark felt soft, almost like skin. I tried my radio. Nothing but static. The snow was getting heavier, and the temperature was dropping. I needed to document what I was seeing and get out before dark. But first, I wanted to find the old logging camp. Maybe that would explain things. The logging camp wasn't hard to find. The company had built it in a natural clearing, protected from the worst winds. What I found there made my hands shake. The old equipment was still there. Steam donkeys, cable systems, saw benches, all the machinery they'd abandoned when the workers died. But the forest had claimed it. Living wood grew through the metal like the trees were eating the machines. Branches wound around steel cables. Roots cracked through engine blocks. Pine needles sprouted from rust holes. I'd never seen anything like it. Trees don't grow that way. They don't grab onto metal and pull it into themselves. But here, the forest seemed to be taking back what the loggers had stolen, one piece at a time. And my chainsaw wouldn't start. I'd checked it that morning, filled it with fresh gas and oil. Now it wouldn't even turn over. I set it down to examine the spark plug and heard footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps in the snow behind me. I turned around. Nothing there. Just my own tracks leading into the camp. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed off the trees and died. No answer. I walked to where I'd heard the steps. The snow was packed down, but not by boots. The prints looked like bare feet, but bigger than any human's. And there were too many toes. That's when I met Jenny. She came walking out of the tree line like she'd been there all along, college-aged, maybe 22, with a backpack full of plant samples and a notebook in her hands. She smiled when she saw me. "You must be Ranger Buchanan," she said. "I'm Jenny Caldwell, forestry student from Davis and Elkins. I'm doing research on forest recovery after logging damage." I felt relieved to see another person. The woods had been getting to me. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" "Same as you, I think. Trying to figure out how these trees got so old so fast." She pointed to the giants around us. According to my research, this area was completely clear-cut in 1922. These trees should be saplings, not ancient giants. "You're right. Something's not adding up." Jenny showed me her notebook. She'd been measuring the trees, counting growth rings from fallen branches, taking soil samples. All her data said the same thing. These trees were impossible. "There's something else," she said, her voice getting quiet. "I've been hearing things. Voices. Like people talking, but when I try to find them, there's nobody there." I thought about the footsteps I'd heard. What kind of voices? Men's voices. They sound scared. And angry. She shivered, but not from the cold. "I think they're trying to tell me something." The snow was falling harder now. Big flakes that stuck to our clothes and made it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. My radio crackled with static, then went silent. No signal. No way to call for help if we needed it. "We should head back," I said. "Storm's getting worse." But when I looked around, I couldn't find my tracks. The snow should have shown exactly where I'd come from, but there was nothing. Just smooth white ground stretching in every direction. "Which way did you come in?" I asked Jenny. She pointed toward the trees, then stopped. I'm not sure. It all looks the same now." That's when we heard them. The voices Jenny had mentioned. Men talking. But the words were muffled, like they were speaking through water. They seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Stay back from there, Charlie. That slope ain't stable. Boss says we got quotas to meet. Whole mountain's gonna come down if we keep cutting." The voices got louder, more urgent. I looked at Jenny. Her face had gone pale. "Those are the loggers," she whispered. "The ones who died in the avalanche." A branch cracked overhead. Then another. I looked up and saw the impossible trees swaying without any wind. Their branches reached toward us like arms. That's when I realized we weren't alone in these woods. We'd never been alone. The dead loggers' voices got louder as the temperature dropped. I could hear them arguing, warning each other, crying out as the avalanche hit. But they'd been dead for 60 years. "We need to get out of here," I told Jenny, but she wasn't listening. She was staring at one of the massive oak trees with a strange look on her face. "Do you see that?" she asked. I followed her gaze. In the bark of the oak, about 6 feet up, was what looked like a face. Human features formed by the natural patterns in the wood, but too detailed to be coincidence. Eyes, nose, mouth twisted in pain. "It's just the bark pattern," I said, but I didn't believe it. The face was too real, too familiar. I'd seen it before in old photographs at the Forest Service office. Charlie Watkins, one of the loggers killed in the avalanche. Jenny walked toward the tree like she was in a trance. "He's trying to tell us something. Jenny, don't—" She pressed her hand against the bark where the face appeared. The tree shuddered. Snow fell from its branches, and Jenny screamed. When she pulled her hand away, her palm was covered in bark-like patterns. Not cuts or scrapes, but her actual skin looked like tree bark, brown and rough and wrong. "What's happening to me?" she cried, staring at her hand. Before I could answer, the ground beneath us started to shake. Not an earthquake, something else, something moving under the forest floor. The snow cracked in long lines that spread out from the base of each tree. I grabbed Jenny's arm. "We're leaving. Now." But when we tried to run, the branches reached down to stop us. Living wood wrapped around our ankles, our wrists. The trees were holding us like prisoners. The voices of the dead loggers got so loud I had to cover my ears. They were screaming warnings about the mountain, about cutting too much, about the forest fighting back. And mixed in with their voices, I heard something else, something older and angrier. The forest itself was speaking. "You came back," it said through the wind. "More men with axes and saws, more destroyers." I tried to reason with it. "We're not loggers. We're here to protect the forest." Lies. All men lie. All men cut and burn and leave scars that never heal. The tree holding Jenny started to pull her closer. The bark pattern spread up her arm like infection. She fought against it, but the wood was too strong. "She will stay," the forest said. "She will become part of what was lost, and you will watch." That's when I remembered my grandfather's axe. Iron. Old iron that had cut thousands of trees. I pulled it from my belt and swung it at the branch holding Jenny. The forest screamed. When the axe bit into the wood, every tree in the clearing shuddered. The sound that came from them wasn't wind or creaking wood. It was pain. Animal pain from something that wasn't supposed to feel anything. The branches let us go. Jenny collapsed in the snow, gasping. The bark patterns on her skin faded but didn't disappear completely. "Run," I told her, but she couldn't move. The cold and shock had gotten to her. I picked her up and carried her away from the talking trees. Behind us, the forest's voice followed like thunder. "You cannot leave. This mountain remembers. This mountain takes what it is owed." The ground started to shake again. Trees that had stood for 200 years began to fall, but not randomly. They were falling to block our path, to trap us in the clearing with the voices of the dead. I found a gap between two fallen trunks and squeezed through, still carrying Jenny. She was mumbling something about roots and darkness and trees that dreamed of revenge. That's when I looked back and saw the truth. The entire mountainside was moving, not just the trees, the ground itself. What I'd thought was a forest was actually one enormous living thing. All the trees, all the roots, all the soil between them. One massive organism that had been growing for centuries, feeding on the remains of the loggers who'd tried to destroy it. And we were trapped inside it. The forest showed me what really happened in 1922. I don't know how. One moment I was carrying Jenny through the snow, and the next I was standing in sunshine, watching men with axes and saws tear down trees that had grown for centuries. The air smelled like sawdust and sweat and dying wood. I could see them clearly. The loggers. Real men with faces and names and families back home. They worked from dawn to dusk, cutting everything in sight. Charlie Watkins, the man whose face I'd seen in the bark. Tom Morrison, who ran the steam donkey. 47 men who thought they were just doing their jobs. But the mountain knew better. Every tree they cut weakened the soil, and every root they dug up made the slopes more unstable. The forest tried to warn them through small avalanches, through equipment failures, through accidents that should have made them stop. They didn't listen. The final avalanche came on a warm February morning when they were cutting near the peak. Half the mountain came down at once, burying the logging camp and everyone in it. The forest saved itself the only way it could, by killing the men who were destroying it. But death wasn't the end. The forest absorbed them. Their bodies became nutrients for new growth. Their memories became part of the mountain's consciousness, and their anger at being abandoned by the company that hired them fed the forest's own rage. For 60 years, the forest had been growing. Not just trees, but awareness, intelligence, the ability to remember and hate and plan revenge. The vision ended. I was back in the snow with Jenny in my arms. But now I understood what we were dealing with. "You have to let us go," I said to the trees around us. "We didn't cut you down. We're trying to help." "Help?" The forest's voice came from everywhere at once. "You carry the axe of a destroyer. Your blood carries the guilt of generations." It was right. My grandfather had cut these mountains, my father too. The Buchanans had been taking from this forest for 3 generations. "But I'm different," I said. "I became a ranger to protect places like this." "Prove it." The trees parted, showing me a path. At the end of the path was a choice. My grandfather's axe lay on one side. On the other side was Jenny, now completely covered in bark, her eyes closed, becoming part of a massive pine tree. "Choose. Save her with iron that has killed thousands of my children, or let her stay and become part of what you destroyed." I looked at the axe. 3 generations of my family had used it to cut down forests. If I picked it up, I'd be just like them, but if I didn't, Jenny would die. The forest was testing me, but there had to be another way. "I choose neither," I said. I walked to the pine tree that was absorbing Jenny. Instead of the axe, I used my bare hands to try to pull her free. The bark bit into my palms, drew blood, but I kept pulling. "I'm sorry," I said to the tree. "I'm sorry for what my family did. I'm sorry for what all the companies did, but she doesn't deserve to pay for their mistakes." The tree hesitated. I felt something change in the forest's attention. "You would bleed for what your ancestors destroyed." "Yes, and more than that." I looked around at the impossible trees, the conscious forest, the living mountain. "I'll make sure this never happens again. I'll get this place protected. No more logging, no more cutting, just forest the way it should be." My hands were bleeding freely now, soaking into the bark of the pine tree. Where my blood touched, the bark patterns on Jenny's skin began to fade. "Blood of the guilty, freely given," the forest murmured. Perhaps some men can learn." Jenny's eyes opened. The bark covering her body cracked and fell away like old scabs. She was still human, still alive, but marked forever by what had tried to claim her. The forest released us. The path home appeared in the snow, clear and straight. But as we stumbled away from the clearing, I heard the mountain's final words. "We will be watching, Ranger Buchanan. This forest remembers everything." The rescue team found us 3 days later, hypothermic and half dead from exposure. They said we'd been missing for 72 hours, but it felt like weeks. Jenny spent a month in the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain the bark-like scars that covered 20% of her skin. I kept my promise to the forest. It took 2 years of paperwork, meetings, and political fighting, but I got the entire Shavers Mountain area designated as protected wilderness. No logging, no development, no roads, just forest, the way it wanted to be. Jenny never went back to forestry school. She became an artist instead, painting pictures of trees with human faces. Her work sells well in galleries, though people think the faces are just her imagination. I stayed a ranger for another 15 years, but something changed in me that December night. I could hear trees talking in healthy forests. Not words exactly, but feelings. Contentment in old growth areas. Pain in places that had been clear-cut. Fear when chainsaws started up. The other rangers thought I was going soft, protecting too much land, fighting too hard against timber sales. They were right. I was different now. I'd learned that forests aren't just collections of trees. They're living things with memories and feelings and the ability to fight back when pushed too far. I retired early and became an activist. I spend my time now traveling to forests that have been damaged, listening to what they're trying to say. Some of them are angry, like Shaver's Mountain. Others are just tired. All of them remember what's been done to them. People think I'm crazy when I tell them trees can think and feel, but I know better. I've seen what happens when we push the natural world too far. I've heard the voices of forests that have decided they've had enough. The last time I visited Shaver's Mountain, the trees were bigger than ever. The path to the old logging camp had grown over completely, but I could still hear them sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was still. The voices of 47 dead loggers, warning anyone who would listen. Some places are not meant to be cut. Some things should not be disturbed. And the forest itself, patient and watchful, waiting to see if humans will finally learn to leave it alone. It's still waiting, and it's still watching, because the forest remembers everything we do to it, and it never, ever forgives.